Daimon, Guardians of Hades romance series, book number 6, written by Felicity Heaton and narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 10. Daimon sat on the edge of the king-size bed in his home in Hong Kong, staring at the pendant resting on the palm of his hand. It had been wrong of him to want Cass like that. Unfaithful. He closed his fingers over the pendant and shut his eyes. Penelope appeared before him, a smile budding on her lips as she worked in the small garden of her home, tending foxgloves and gladioli. A dirty white pinafore covered part of her dull blue-gray dress, but the scooped neckline was low enough to reveal the pendant. It swayed and twinkled in the summer sunshine as she leaned over, her knees pressing into the grass. Beyond her, the old cottage had seen better days, needed repairing again, would forever need repairing. She sat back and brushed her hand across her forehead, clearing damp strands of sun-kissed auburn hair from it. He held the pendant more tightly, watching her as she worked, tending to the garden she had loved so much. Waiting for him. The pendant could show him any moment when she had been wearing it, allowing him to see how happy she had been when he had given it to her, among other things. Rather than soothing him as it usually did, today the sight of her only made him question his feelings about her. He waited, hoping, needing to feel that calm he did whenever he watched her like this. That sense that remaining loyal to her was what he wanted more than anything, that his love for her was eternal. It didn't come. She wasn't the woman he wanted to see. She wasn't the one he needed to see. He opened his fingers and stared at the pendant, cursed himself as another memory played out before him. One of Cass going under the water, of her breaching the surface and fighting for air, of her looking at him with hurt in her eyes and a hell of a lot of anger. Anger he deserved. Hiding here in his home in Hong Kong wasn't going to get him anywhere. He wouldn't feel better until he had apologized to her. It had been a knee-jerk reaction, one he should have been strong enough to contain. She was right. He had been the one who had tried to kiss her, and he had blamed her for it, and for how guilty he felt because he had wanted to taste her lips, and so much more. He sighed and stood, slipped the pendant back onto the clasp on his phone, and shoved the device into the pocket of his black jeans. He grabbed the navy turtleneck sweater he had discarded on top of the white dresser and tugged it on before he stepped. Darkness whirled around him, and then he was standing in the front garden of the Tokyo mansion. He strode to the house and unlaced his boots, froze when Cass's voice rang in the late afternoon air. "I need to take care of Milos. I've left him alone too long already." Cass sighed, a light sound that teased his ears but did nothing to calm his mood as it took a sharp nosedive. Who the hell was Milos? Acid burned through his veins, settled in his stomach, and scoured it. Cass had been giving him the cold shoulder since Hong Kong, and the moment in the bath, had avoided him for 2 days straight. It had been what he wanted, so why had he hated every moment of it? Why had he hated the fact she had been keeping her distance? Was this why she had avoided him? She felt bad that she had wanted him in that moment when she had another man. Whoever the bastard was, he was Greek. For some reason, that only made him angrier. "Are you strong enough to do this?" Miranda sounded concerned. "All charged up again. I have enough strength to transport myself to Keravastasis, take care of Milos's needs for a day or two, and then I'll be able to transport myself back here." Take care of Milos's needs? Daimon wanted to growl at that. "Give him my love and a hug from me." Miranda's warm words only increased Daimon's urge to growl. Cass's signature disappeared, and Daimon kicked off his boots, dumped them on the rack, and opened the front door, trying to ignore the black urge to follow her. He made a beeline for his room in the north wing, striding past Miranda, needing a moment to rein in his needs before they got out of control and got him into trouble. The darkness seething in his veins refused to abate, had him shoving the white panel door of his room open and pacing in a circle on the golden straw mats. Who was Milos? Her lover? Husband? He tunneled his fingers through his hair and clutched it, clawed it back until his scalp stung. What did it matter to him? A growl peeled from his lips. A lot. It mattered a lot. He pivoted and stepped before he could consider what he was doing, and the cold dark of the teleport gave way to warmth as sunshine bathed him. The dry air smelled of earth, and to his right waves gently rolled over a stony shore, tugging at the pebbles and shifting them around. Daimon blew out his breath and opened his eyes, stared at the white blocky two-story buildings that hugged the curving bay of Karavastasis and the brown hills spotted with pale boulders that rose above them. The small ramshackle village was quiet in the morning sunshine, only a few older mortals coming and going along the seafront beneath the trees that followed the sweeping line of the beach, clutching bread and exchanging greetings as they passed each other. This was where Cass lived? Did she live here with Milos, playing the doting wife? He tried to shut out the image of her with another man as he picked his way down the bluff, the ochre soil already warm beneath his bare feet. He should have at least put some shoes on. What did it matter, though? He didn't intend for anyone to see him. When he reached the bottom of the small rock promontory, he eased down onto his backside and waited. He had no idea where Cass lived, but if she had been gone a while, there was a chance she might need to visit the small store. Unless her lover had already stocked the cupboards for her. He squeezed his eyes shut, not wanting to picture her in one of the small villas, doing mundane things like cooking lunch or baking bread. Homely things. It wasn't a problem. He found it impossible to imagine Cass in that role. She didn't dress like a woman who did such things, and she hadn't once shown any inclination to cook. She struck him as the sort of woman who preferred to have someone wait on them. He opened his eyes and scanned the area. None of the houses were big or grand enough to warrant hiring staff. He growled when his mind supplied that Milos probably took care of the domestic things, worshipping Cass in every way possible. That growl cut short as the blue door of the store opened and Cass walked out, wearing the same slinky and sexy black dress she always did. No one batted an eye as she greeted them. In fact, they all bowed their heads, and one of the older women even stopped her for a brief conversation. When the woman walked away, it was with a smile and a look of relief on her face. It struck him that no one viewed Cass as out of place because they knew she was a witch, and that she helped them, which seemed impossible. Cass didn't have a kind bone in her body. He instantly took that back. She did. He had seen it more than once, especially when she was around Mirinda, and she had done all she could to heal his brothers whenever they had been injured. He just didn't want to soften towards her, and admitting she had good traits as well as bad ones was a path that would lead him to doing just that. He wanted to be angry with her. His eyes slowly widened, because he was jealous. He tried to discount that, to laugh at the impossible notion that he was envious of the bastard Cass had come to see, who lived on the beautiful island with her. But he couldn't. He eased onto his feet and tailed Cass, keeping his distance from her, nodding as he passed the old woman who Cass had comforted. He was tempted to ask what Cass had said to her and about the things she did for the community, but the thought of losing sight of Cass kept him moving forwards. She followed the road as she reached the other side of the bay, and he kept the distance between them steady. Stones that had fallen into the road from the hill that gently sloped up to his right bit into the soles of his feet, but he ignored the pain as he followed Cass. She turned left, following a trail downwards towards the shore. Daimon hurried after her and stopped at the start of the path. Below him, crystal-clear blue water lapped at the rocky coast and a small stony beach. Set just back from that on a stretch of flat pale rock was a single-story flat-roofed white villa, surrounded by a white painted stone wall that needed repairing. It had fallen down in some places, the stone tumbling into the small patch of dry dirt that had been turned into what appeared to be an herb garden. Or it had been. The plants were all dead now, shriveled and brown. From the front of the villa, a terrace with a low wall extended outwards towards the sea, and looked as if someone had painted it white more recently than the rest of the house. Stripped tree trunks as thick as his arm supported a dark wooden flat roof over the terrace, giving it some shade. He ducked down as one set of blue wooden shutters opened, revealing a dark interior. "Come now, Milos. Don't be moody with me." Cass's voice held a playful note. Daimon growled low, the darkness surging through him with renewed ferocity. He stood and shoved the rickety gate open and stormed down the path, determined to see who this Milos was. What did this bastard have that Daimon didn't? There had to be some reason she had given her heart to this male. He had to be the reason she had declared she wasn't interested in Daimon's heart, because she already loved another. A vicious hiss greeted him as he neared the terrace, a low growl following it. Daimon stopped dead and looked down at the mangy white and ginger cat on the terracotta tiles. Ragged scar tissue ran over its nose and part of its left ear was missing, and it looked as if it either needed a good brush or a heavy dose of flea killer. From inside the house, Cass made a kissing noise. Daimon took a hard step forwards, determined to stop whatever was going on in the house. The cat growled louder. The kissing noise grew louder too. Daimon froze as Cass stepped out onto the terrace, her blue eyes on the cat, and then him. She huffed. I had wondered why Mr. Milos was grumpy. I can't blame him. I'm not exactly pleased to see you either. Daimon's mouth flapped open. Milos was the cat? He looked down at the ancient thing that was still blocking his route. The cat hissed, bearing 3 yellowing fangs. The bottom left one was missing. Gods, he was an idiot. All the fight that had been building inside him suddenly bled out of him. I could mention how you're stalking me. I shan't, but I could. Cass smiled when he frowned at her, and her shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. I just wanted that out there. Fine. So she wasn't the only one with a bad habit of stalking. But how was he to have known Milos was a damned cat? Cass looked down at the beast, her voice like a sigh as she said, It's a cliché, but it's true. All good witches need a cat. Daimon hunkered down and held his hand out to the animal. It snubbed him, standing and turning away, flicking its tail. Milos is normally so sociable. Cass looked at him. Maybe he's picking up on the fact I don't want you here. He sighed and stood again, jerked his chin towards the feral Tom. Cats don't tend to be very impressed by gods. That's all this is. She shrugged again and turned away from him too. I can't imagine why. He clenched his jaw, bit back the words he wanted to say, and focused on the reason he had come back from Hong Kong to see her. I'm sorry. She stopped in the doorway and looked across at him, her eyebrows pinned high on her forehead. Did you say something? Daimon huffed. I said I'm sorry. For what? Another attempt to drown me? Being as frigid as your power? Upsetting Mr. Milos? Or perhaps you're sorry for stalking me? She turned back towards him, her black eyebrows lowering into a frown. I'm not even going to point out how angry you would have been if our positions had been reversed. I'm bigger than that. She hit him with a sly smile that said she was enjoying this, having him at her mercy. I'm only here because I pulled the short straw when we were deciding which of us was going to protect you and get your arse back to Tokyo. He folded his arms across his chest. She chuckled, swept the black nails of her right hand across her chest, and smiled again. You're a terrible liar. She turned back towards the door. I'm flattered you felt the need to stalk me, and disappeared inside. Daimon glared down at Milos, who glared right back at him and moved to block his path again. You have something against me. I get that. All your kind do. He kept his voice low as he crouched in front of the cat. His gaze flipped to the door and then back, meeting Milos's green eyes. Small god, I ask you that when the time comes, that you'll do your duty as a guardian deity and protect the one you clearly treasure and love. The cat stared at him for a moment, and then stood and rubbed against his knee, purring deeply. Daimon took that as a yes. Milos moved aside and hopped up onto the white wall, his tail flicking back and forth as he stared out at the sea. Did Cass know that Milos wasn't just a cat? He wasn't sure what things about his world she did or didn't know, but maybe it was time he found out. He stepped up onto the terrace, the tiles cool beneath his feet, and into the small house. It was cramped on the inside with an open kitchen and living room and a corridor leading deeper into the house. It was far from the glamorous home he had imagined Cass living in. This was as rustic as it came, with furniture that looked handmade and a tiny kitchen consisting of an old white stove, a sink, and 2 cupboards. The only light in the room was a naked bulb hanging in the middle of the ceiling and an oil lamp on the desk to his left. Maybe the coven didn't pay their witches well. He knew a thing or two about covens, and most of them operated like mercenaries, taking on contracts across the world. He glanced around at the small home again. Either the coven only paid Cass a small wage for her work and kept the bulk of the money for themselves, or Cass liked being off-grid for some reason.
I'm just grabbing some things.
Cass's voice drifted from the shadowy corridor.
Make yourself at home.
Outside, Milos growled. The deity wasn't happy about being left behind again. Cass, Daimon started, shoved his hand up his forehead and over his white hair, and blew out his breath. I am sorry. He wasn't sure why he needed her to accept his apology so badly, but he did. He needed to know things were all right between them, that he hadn't messed everything up, and he needed her to know that he was aware he hadn't been the easiest man to put up with. He knew he had done a lot of things wrong.
About trying to drown me?
She poked her head out of her room, an expectant look on her beautiful face. About that. About a lot of things. He clenched his fists at his sides, fighting for the right words.
I could list them for you if it makes it easier.
She stepped back into the corridor.
But I won't.
He waited for her to go back to packing, but she lingered, and her aquamarine eyes gained a somber edge he didn't like.
Do you know why I moved here?
She glanced around the small house, her fine black eyebrows furrowing slightly.
I came here because it was quiet. A world away from persecution. A world away from everything.
Everything? The way she had said that word made him feel that her coming to this remote and sparsely populated island had been about more than just avoiding humans who had wanted to drown her for being a witch. She had been trying to escape something else, too. Was there another reason you moved here? He wanted to take a step towards her to regain her attention, but forced himself to keep still, giving her space he could feel she needed.
No, none. It was warm, quiet. The people respect me.
She was quick to duck out of sight, back into the other room. He wasn't the only terrible liar in the building. He mulled over what she had said and how she had looked. She had picked somewhere warm where people respected her. She didn't feel respected in chilly Russia? He took in his surroundings. This island home in the Aegean had to be the complete opposite of where she had grown up. All the covens he had come across had lived together in a building big enough to accommodate them all. The last coven he had crossed paths with had owned an enormous estate in England, with acres of land and several large buildings on the land, including a palatial main house. He imagined Cass's coven lived in a large compound complete with a mansion, too. So why had she traded a life there for a life of quiet and respect? His gut squirmed in response to that word, one he could hardly apply to his actions around her. Neither he nor his brothers had shown her respect. They had all treated her with distrust and tried to keep her out of their business. Maybe he needed to be the one to change that, because deep down he did respect her. He saw her value, what an asset she was for his side, and that in the battle ahead she could be the key to them winning. He would make her see that he believed in her. He blew out his breath. He just wasn't sure where the hell to begin. He looked out of the door, struck by the beauty of the place Cass called home. Endless blue water, dusty hills, white houses that seemed to reflect what light there was, making the place seem even brighter. The warm air was dry, not moist as it was in Hong Kong, and the fresh breeze carried the scent of the sea. Everything about this place felt so tranquil. He could picture himself here, whiling away his days, eating well and living off the small patch of land Cass owned. He imagined her garden had been lush before, well tended. He drifted towards the other window to his right, wanting to see the view in that direction. When he'd had his fill of the beautiful coastline and the itch to check on Cass had grown too fierce to ignore, he turned back towards the main door, and his gaze caught on a letter on her desk, on a word that leaped out at him and had him frowning as he leaned closer for a better look. Offspring. He scanned the letter and then read it again, a weight settling in his gut as he tried to make sense of it. His thoughts spun as he kept reading it over and over, only a few things sticking in his mind. It was from her coven. It was the last time they would ask her to return home. There was a man awaiting her arrival. She would bear a child as expected of her. It was dated 4 days ago. He swallowed the lump in his throat and braced one hand against the desk, supporting his weight. He reached for the letter and stopped, his hand hovering barely an inch from it as he battled the urge to screw it up and toss it away, as if that would make a difference. Cass was promised to another. He had come here fearing she had a man, and she did, one who was waiting for her, expecting her to bear him a child for her coven.
Ready.
Cass's voice had him jerking upright and spinning away from the desk, his heart rushing in his ears as his gaze settled on her. She sauntered towards him, her hips swaying enticingly, a slight smile curling her rosy lips, flirting with him again. All his feelings, his frustration and anger must have been painted across his face, because she drew up short and her ice-blue eyes warmed with what looked a hell of a lot like concern.
What's wrong?
She lowered the black bag she had packed to her side and canted her head, leaning towards him. Nothing, he snapped. I'm bored of waiting for you. I'm leaving now, with or without you. She frowned at him, stared into his eyes for so long that he feared she would be able to read why he was upset with her, even when he wasn't really sure himself. He had told her that he didn't have a heart to give her, and she had told him that she didn't want it anyway. Everything that had happened between them had been nothing more than harmless flirting. So why the hell did he feel as if she had just ripped out his heart and squeezed it until it shattered? I'm leaving. He turned away from her and came face to face with the cat. The ginger and white Tom glared at him and then sauntered past him with his head and tail held high, heading for Cass.
Oh, Milos, I'll have to come back to feed him now the nearby summer residents have gone home to the mainland.
She began to bend to pet the cat. Not gonna happen. Daimon bit those words out from between clenched teeth, wrestling with his feelings, fighting to find some balance again. You'll have to ask a neighbor. She straightened and scowled at him.
I just said they've all gone away. This cat is my responsibility, and he's been with me a long time. I won't leave him behind like that. I won't abandon him.
Abandon. That word stuck in his mind. He could see in her eyes that she meant what she had said. If she wouldn't abandon an animal, she definitely wouldn't abandon the man who was waiting for her. She had only been flirting with him. He hammered that into his head, over and over again when it refused to stick. None of it had been real. She had been teasing him, tempting him, probably finding it amusing. She knew about his problem. Had it given her pleasure when she had found a way to circumvent his ice and she had touched him, making him believe something impossible, that he didn't have to be alone anymore? I'm leaving. He closed his eyes and turned away from her.
Daimon.
She grabbed his arm, sending a hot shiver rolling up it.
What's wrong? Don't tell me nothing. Something is wrong.
He opened his eyes and looked across at her, thought of 1,000 things he wanted to say. He had foolishly thought she had really liked him. He had foolishly allowed himself to feel something for the first time in centuries. He had foolishly admitted the truth to himself, that while he had loved Penelope, it hadn't been true love, the sort that would have lasted forever. He had foolishly admitted that the loyalty he felt towards Penelope had been forged as a shield to protect him from the loneliness he had endured for centuries, giving him a reason to not look at other females, a reason not to feel cold and forsaken whenever he was around his brothers and their women. In the end, only one word rose to the tip of his tongue, the rest of them held back by fear, by pain that had grown since meeting Cassandra, agony that ripped at him every moment he was near her. Nothing. She bit out a curse in Russian, picked up her cat, and cuddled the wretched thing. All the while, Milos glared at him. Daimon glared right back. He knew he was being a dick. He didn't need the small god pointing it out to him. He was sure Milos had been a dick himself more than once in his life, had probably been a bastard to Cass countless times since she had found him.
He's coming with us, then.
She tipped her chin up, her sparkling blue eyes daring him to say a word against it. Fine, whatever. Daimon took hold of her bare arm and stilled as that heat rolled through him again, marveling over the fact he could touch her and she wasn't in pain, wasn't in any danger. He brushed his thumb over her skin, wanting to feel it without his gloves, flesh to flesh, as he had in the bath. He shut down that need. She couldn't be his. She already had someone waiting for her.
Daimon,
she whispered, pressing closer to him, until the heat of her body soaked into his clothes and ignited a need to tug her closer still, so they were pressed together, not a molecule of air between them. He stepped instead, embracing the cold darkness, letting it wash over him to give him strength. Milos hissed and growled throughout the teleport, and continued as they landed in the middle of the main room of the mansion. Cass struggled with the cat, gently chastising it, increasing that feeling Daimon had, the one that said she didn't know the truth about cats.
Neko!
Aiko leaped onto her feet from the couches in front of him and hurried over to Cass, her dark eyes bright for the first time since Escher had disappeared.
Kawaii!
She drew that word out as she melted over the raggedy cat who was in no way worthy of being called cute. Milos went still in Cass's arms, purring now and evidently enjoying the sudden attention.
What is its name?
Aiko didn't take her eyes off the animal.
Mr. Milos,
Cass offered.
Ah, Milos-chan, you are so cute.
Aiko went to touch him and then hesitated, her dark eyes lifting to Cass.
Can I? Of course.
Cass smiled, the first one she had given to Aiko, and it was strange but nice to see her more relaxed around her. Daimon wanted to warn Aiko that Milos was one cranky son of a bitch, but she touched the beast before he could. The cat was all sweetness with her, rubbing her hand and purring deeply. Aiko smiled properly for the first time in too long, her eyes lighting up as she petted the cat, who greedily devoured the love she poured onto him. He watched her as Cass let her take Milos into her arms, as she carried him like a baby to the couches and petted him, a smile constantly etched on her face. He hadn't been able to make her feel better, no matter how hard he had tried, and gods, that made him feel like a complete failure. He had wanted to make her smile like this, lifting her spirits. Cass's gaze lingered on his face.
Don't feel bad. You're a bit too frosty for Aiko to pet, and petting cats makes a lot of people feel better about things.
She walked away before he could glare at her, and whispered words trailed in her wake.
But I'd rather pet you.
Daimon turned slightly, looking over his shoulder at her back as she walked away from him, an ache building inside him, a consuming need to go after her so she could do just that. He fought it, waging war against the urges she stirred in him, the attraction that blazed between them. But he wasn't strong enough to deny those things, even when they only caused him pain worse than anything he had felt before. He wanted her. He could touch her. Yet he still couldn't have her. The ground shook and the air trembled. Daimon's senses lit up. Demons. Chapter 11. Cass had barely had a chance to set her bag down in her quarters when the ground shook and the air trembled, and then went eerily still. Voices broke the dreadful silence. Daimon and Cal. Had something happened? Her eyes widened as she sensed it. Power. Familiar power. The Erinyes. She rushed from her room, bare feet loud on the wooden slats of the covered walkway, and didn't stop until she had reached the main room of the house.
What was that?
She did her best not to sound as out of breath as she was. The combination of running and adrenaline enough to have her panting for air. Daimon didn't take his eyes off the front door of the mansion. They can't breach the wards. They'll keep bouncing them back.
I'll believe that when I see it.
She stretched her arms out for balance as another miniature earthquake hit and was gone in a flash. She hurried to Aiko and Mirinda. Megan got up from the couch, her hands lowering to cover her baby bump, rubbing it through her loose mulberry jumper. Her chocolate eyes sparkled with worry as she looked at Cass, her brow furrowed. Cass presumed Ares had dropped her off for some time with the girls, something he often did. As gruff as the god of fire could be, Cass shared Megan's wish that he was here. 3 gods protecting the mansion seemed better than 2.
Someone care to send a message?
She said, and Cal gave her a black look. She shrugged it off.
I'm not saying you 2 strapping gods can't handle this alone, but I would rather have 6 strapping gods standing between us and whatever is on the other side of this barrier. You have a pregnant woman here.
Daimon looked back at her, a scowl darkening his features, darkness reigning in his eyes. Darkness that had nothing to do with the fact she had questioned their strength and prowess, or the mention of Megan. It looked a lot like jealousy. Because she would rather have 6 gods fighting at her side? Her eyes widened slightly, enough that he noticed and turned away from her. Because she had referred to his brothers as strapping. It was all right for her to call him strapping, but gods forbid she speak well of his brothers. Cass checked on the ladies when another tremor rocked the building and the power she could sense in the air grew stronger. Aiko frantically petted Mr. Milos, who was still purring happily, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Mari had closed ranks with Megan, her eyes verging on Violet as she stared ahead of her at the door. Megan was rubbing her belly with one hand, worry scored on her face, and in her other was a mobile phone. Her thumb shook as she tapped the on-screen keyboard. A relieved breath escaped her as she sent the message. "It'll be fine," Cal said, far too much confidence in his tone. He wasn't sure either. "They're just trying to frighten us."
Might I remind everyone that frightening a pregnant woman is a bad thing?
Cass checked on Megan again. She was breathing faster now, holding her stomach. When she noticed Cass looking at her, she forced a wobbly smile.
I'm peachy.
She wasn't. She was as far from peachy as she could get. She was petrified. Something big hit the barrier and everyone fought for balance, Mari clutching Megan and keeping her upright. Cass refused to be rattled by it. She gathered her strength, just in case. These demons and goddesses didn't frighten her. Daimon muttered a black curse, drawing her gaze to him. She knew the look on his face, could read it like a book as she glanced at Cal. Things didn't look good. "Stay inside." He turned to her and the other women as he motioned for Cal to move forwards. Cass snorted at that.
Stay inside? I don't think so. I'm not some cowering, weak female.
She looked over at Mari.
Stay inside with the others.
Mari leveled a glare on her.
I don't think so. I'm not some cowering. Someone has to protect the others.
Cass cut her off because she didn't have time for this. The sensation of power in the air was growing stronger, or the barrier around the building was growing weaker, which didn't bear thinking about. Daimon stopped at the door and looked over his shoulder, his expression warning her that he was going to argue against her. His gaze caught on Megan and he paled, phenomenal pain darkening his eyes, deeper than anything she had seen in them before. "Cass," he said, her name like ambrosia as it rolled off his tongue, flooding her with strength and heat. "Muster the best protective spell you can manage, because one of the wards just went down." Ice cascaded down her spine. She began an incantation in her mind, one that would drain her but might be their best shot at keeping everyone safe, and followed Daimon as he opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, Cal trailing behind him. Cass built the spell, weaving together several different ones, a slave to her need to protect not only the women sheltering behind her. She wanted to protect the god striding ahead of her, too, his shoulders back and head tipped up, ice glittering on his black gloves as he curled his fingers into fists. Cass closed her eyes, centered herself, and raised her hands as she uttered the words to cast the spell, the strongest barrier she had ever created. She felt it as it launched into the air, as it hit a point 40 feet above her and swept downwards in all directions to form a dome over the house and the grounds, expelling anyone she viewed as a threat, knocking them backwards. Her legs turned to jelly beneath her, but she kept her focus on the barrier, poured more strength into it until she was on the verge of collapse. The demons battered it, pressing against it and slashing at the invisible wall, rolling up on it in waves. She opened her eyes and pressed her hands forwards, weathering the blows and shoring up the barrier where it began to weaken. Another wave came at it, followed by another, each of them a coordinated attack, as if they were testing it, testing her. That feeling only grew when violet-black smoke billowed above the white-rendered wall of the mansion grounds, as dark as the ribbed tiles that topped it, and the demons suddenly appeared. Two female voices trailed into nothing.
She is stronger than the others. She will give us what we need.
A shiver tripped down Cass's back and arms, spreading over her thighs as words whispered in the wind.
She will be pleased to hear that.
Chapter 12. Miranda helped Cass into the house, bearing her weight as the witch fumbled each step, her eyes fixed on the ground in a distant stare. Daimon trailed after her, obeying the deep need to be close to her, still shaken by the fact she had collapsed and what he had heard. She was too pale as Miranda helped her down onto one of the couches, close to Megan. Ares appeared, the haste of his teleport and how swiftly he turned, disturbing the black ribbons of smoke that tried to cling to him. His fiery gaze scanned the room, and the moment he spotted Megan, he was moving, closing the distance between them and sinking to his knees beside her. "You okay, sweetheart?" He stroked her cheek as he gazed up at her, his hand trembling, worry written across every line of his face. She nodded.
Cass kept us safe.
Ares looked at her, gratitude shining in his eyes before he even said, "Thank you." Cass managed a nod and then went back to struggling for air. Daimon stood near the door of the house as the rest of his brothers appeared, staring at her and unsure what to do, torn between going to her and remaining where he was. He wasn't sure she would appreciate him coddling her in the way Ares fussed over Megan. She was strong and had reacted badly when he had questioned that strength before. Voices filled the tense silence as Cal filled Merrick, Valen, and Karis, and Katerina and Ava in on what had happened. Daimon was glad his brothers had all brought their women to the mansion. He had the feeling it was better they remained here, where they had a better shot at protecting them all. In fact, he was going to propose that everyone move back into the mansion, something that probably wouldn't go down well with some of his brothers. Cass finally lifted her head, and her weary eyes settled on him. He lifted his hand, stopped himself, and lowered it again. Whatever look was on his face, whatever feeling she was reading in him, ones he couldn't hold back right now or cover up, it drew a shaky smile from her. He stared into her eyes, the foolish part of him hoping that she could see that he would do all in his power to protect her, even though she couldn't be his, was destined for another.
I don't think I'm the first witch they've targeted.
She sounded as tired as she looked, her voice weak, tearing at him, increasing the need to go to her and tend to her, even when he wasn't sure what he could do. I don't think so either. He hated the way she looked down at her knees as he said that, how worry creased her brow and she picked at her dress, looking small and vulnerable. Darkness rose within him, a snarling and twisted thing that demanded he protect her, roared at him to hunt those who were a threat to her before they could get near her again. Ares slowly stood. How the hell did they breach a ward on the mansion? His older brother stroked Megan's hair, a constant motion, as if he needed to feel her beneath his fingers to make himself believe that she was safe there with him. Daimon could understand why Ares was shaken. The mansion was the one place that should be safe, impenetrable. Valen and Cal shrugged at the same time. Sometimes the similarities between them were frightening. Same athletic build, same moody personality, same recklessness. The only thing that had made them stand apart once was the color of their eyes. Even their hair had been the same golden color, until Ava had decided to dye Valen's a neon shade of violet. Merrick was too quiet, and Daimon wasn't the only one who noticed it. Karis twisted the silver band on his thumb around it as his green gaze settled on their brother. Merrick must have felt the weight of expectation on his shoulders, because he looked at Daimon and then Karis and said, The Wraith. What about that bastard? Daimon snarled, the darkness getting the better of him as it conjured images of Escher in the underworld hunting that demon. Eli stabbed me with his blade. He must have taken my memories as he did with Escher. Merrick looked at Karis, his dark eyebrows furrowing slightly above his earthy eyes as he shoved his hand through the wavy lengths of his short hair, pushing it back. It was after we changed the wards, after Eli penetrated them to save Lisabetta, when we all picked a ward and kept it secret. Where did you place your ward? Karis's deep voice was calm, but held a note of concern that echoed in his eyes. The maple in the southeast corner. Karis looked to Daimon. Daimon nodded. That was the one that went down. I can pick another ward, Merrick said. Karis shook his head and worried his lower lip with the pad of his thumb as his black eyebrows drew down, his green eyes falling to rest on the golden mats beneath his feet. Something was troubling his brother, and he wasn't the only one who could see it. Ares watched Karis closely, the concern that filled his eyes growing. I will send a messenger to Father to ask for a new one. Karis spoke those words slowly, and something dawned on Daimon. He was worried about admitting to their father that they had messed something else up, and Daimon couldn't blame him. As the oldest brother, Karis had taken on the role of leader of their small force, and with that role came the responsibility for everything that went wrong as well as right. Hades didn't look favorably upon failure. He had drummed that into all of them from an early age. Merrick looked at everyone in turn, and Daimon couldn't recall the last time his older brother had looked as if he felt he had fucked up. Don't sweat it. Ares' deep voice rolled over the room like a calming tide and seemed to set Merrick at ease. Nothing bad happened, and it wasn't your fault. There's nothing you could have done about it. Karis continued to stare at the mats. We could have changed the ward sooner, Merrick put in. Karis finally lifted his head, settling his gaze on Merrick. We could have, but none of us thought to do it. This is on all of us. But Karis would be the one to take the full force of their father's disappointment and anger. Merrick looked as if he wanted to say something, but Ares shook his head, and Merrick's face crumpled. Ares was right. Offering to be the one to tell their father about this wouldn't change the outcome. As far as their father was concerned, Karis was responsible for what happened, and he would lay the blame squarely on his shoulders and his shoulders alone. The air in the room turned gloomy, oppressively silent. Daimon looked at Cass and Megan and then back at his brothers. I think everyone should move into the mansion. That didn't meet with the resistance he had expected. Everyone nodded. Well, everyone except Karis. We can layer in new wards, enough to keep the demons out. Cal glanced at Karis, who dipped his head this time. I will ask for several. Karis's green gaze slid to his left to land on Cass, who was still too pale for Daimon's liking. You cast a barrier around this place. She shifted to face him and nodded, plastered on a facade that couldn't hide her true feelings from Daimon. She was worried. He was worried, too. He didn't want the enemy near her, and the thought that they were after her had him on the verge of losing himself to the darker side of his blood, the protective and possessive side that had come from his father. What other magic can you do? Karis said. Cass stood, waving away Mirinda when she tried to help her, and walked on what she probably thought were steady legs towards his brother. In Daimon's eyes, she looked ready to collapse again, stoking that need to go to her, to make her take his support and not let her push him away as she had with Mirinda. Now wasn't the time to be prideful. She had taken a hit, was shaken by it, and that was fine. It was okay to be weak sometimes. It didn't mean she wasn't strong. No one here would question her strength or think less of her if she let her true feelings show, revealing how badly this had shaken her.
Offensive magic. Defensive, too, like the barrier.
She sounded distant, as if she wasn't quite there in the room with them. Daimon took a step towards her, driven by a need to be close to her, and she looked across at him. Is there any other magic you can do? Anything not classified as offensive or defensive? Her black eyebrows rose, her gaze unfocused as she looked right through him, a thoughtful edge to her expression. You healed Mari. Cal rubbed Mirinda's arm through her dark orange sweater. Maybe they want you for that. Cass tensed. It was the smallest tightening of her shoulders, but Daimon noticed it. Whatever you just thought, spit it out, Daimon said as he took a step towards her. Her blue eyes shifted to his, and she looked as if she wanted to tell him no. But then she sighed and her shoulders relaxed.
There is magic I researched, but I've never performed it before. It's forbidden. No witch has used such spells in centuries.
What spells? He didn't like the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. She cast a glance around them all, gauging their reactions.
Necromancy.
Shock crossed his brothers' faces in a wave. Cass quickly raised her hands, her palms facing him.
I never attempted it. I only know the theory, what others have done. I've only read notes and reports from other witches, centuries-old accounts that are probably more fiction than fact.
Cal took a hard step towards her, a storm building in his eyes, the tips of his blonde ponytail catching a breeze as he stared at Cass. Do you think you could restore a soul into a body? Cass's gaze shifted to Cal and her black eyebrows furrowed, the flicker of emotion in her eyes revealing that she knew the path of Cal's thoughts just as Daimon did.
Maybe. But I wouldn't do it. I'm sorry, Callistos. It's too risky. The chances of that soul coming back wrong are too high.
Karis reached out and laid a hand on Cal's shoulder. We will find Calendria's soul and find a way to guide it into the Elysian fields. That will be enough for her. She will be happy. Cal turned on him, his face darkening as the breeze that swirled through the room gained strength. But if we could bring her back— No! Ares cut him off, his voice a deep growl, harder than Daimon had heard it in a long time. Tampering with her like that. Cass is right. What if something went wrong, Cal? Their youngest brother blanched as the wind suddenly dropped, swallowed hard, and looked at them all, his eyebrows furrowed, desperation written in every line of his face. But He didn't seem able to finish that sentence. He just stood there looking between them all, a storm raging in his eyes that slowly abated, leaving his irises blue again. He lowered his head and looked down at his feet. "I'm sorry." "There's nothing to apologize for." Karis touched his shoulder again, gripping it gently as he closed the distance between them. "We all want to see her again." Cal nodded. So did everyone else. Daimon looked at Cass, studying her, trying to piece together what the enemy wanted with her magic. "So the enemy wants a new necromancer. It's a good enough theory. The gates are closed to all traffic. The only ones who could perform such a role for our enemy now is a necromancer who happened to be in this world, which would be extremely rare and hard to find. Or a witch. But what do they want with one? They want someone to raise the dead?" Cass's eyes slowly widened, a horrified edge filling them as she shook her head, causing her long wavy black hair to brush her bare shoulders.
Not raise the dead. Raise their dead. Necromancy. The magical form of it could hypothetically place the souls the enemy holds in their possession into new physical bodies. It could restore them completely. The necromancer used the souls he held as puppets, but with magic, they might be able to restore them to how they had been, independent beings under their own control.
Merrick folded his arms across his chest, his dark linen shirt tightening over his muscles. "That would be bad." Everyone murmured in agreement. They had been dealing blows to the enemy, weakening them. The last thing they needed was the enemy raising their dead, strengthening their side again. "We'll keep Cass out of the enemy's hands." Daimon schooled his features, hiding the dark need to protect her that filled him, but knew he had failed to conceal it when Cass's beautiful face softened, her eyes warming as she stared into his. Karis turned to Cass. "Will you be all right?" She looked at his brother and wearily nodded. Daimon barely bit back the growl that rolled up his throat, his darker side pushing to the fore as he leveled a glare on his brother. He should have been the one to ask her that question. Instead, he had hidden his worry for her behind a veil, giving another male a chance to be the one who showed concern for her well-being. He thought about the letter, about what he had read in it. She was promised to another. What point was there in showing her that he cared about her? He couldn't afford to grow closer to her if she was only going to end up leaving him for another man. He wasn't sure he would survive such a blow.
"I'm concerned about the enemy. What they said," she sighed. "They've been testing other witches, and it felt as if they were testing me. Those demons hit the barrier in waves, as if they had wanted to see how much damage it could take before it would fall."
"I think it was just a test to see how powerful your magic was, not how much damage a barrier cast by you could take before it failed." Daimon shoved his hands into his pockets and took hold of his phone, found the pendant attached to it and held it. It was better he kept his distance from Cass, endeavored to keep things between them as they were, not letting his feelings grow into anything more. He would remain loyal to Penelope. He owed her that much, didn't he? Or was he just using her memory to keep his heart closed, to protect himself from more pain? Ares cast a worried glance down at Megan. "I think I should take you to the underworld." Megan turned on him, planting her hands on her hips at the same time.
"No, you need me here. I'm not going to the underworld. I won't be separated from you. Not right now. Not ever."
Her hand shifted to her baby bump and she clutched it through her jumper, shaking her head.
"I won't go."
Her voice hitched.
"I need to be here."
"It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay." Ares stretched his hands out to her and she backed off a step, shaking her head more frantically.
"Maybe we shouldn't have gone through with it."
Her voice tightened with each word and Daimon could sense her mounting panic. Ares' face crumpled and he took hold of her arm, gently pulled her to him and settled his left arm around her trembling shoulders as he placed his right hand on her belly. He rubbed it gently between her hands. "Don't talk like that, baby. This is a blessing. Nothing will happen to the baby. Nothing will happen to you. I swear it. I love you both." He dropped a kiss on her forehead.
"I'm fat,"
Megan muttered. The panic Daimon could feel in her washing away as she sagged against Ares. Ares smiled softly, his eyes warmed by love. You've never been so sexy. You're beautiful." Daimon looked away, unable to bear it. He felt Cass's eyes on him, but refused to look at her, kept his head down so he didn't have to see anyone. He couldn't bring himself to look at them, not when the rage he had been holding on to for centuries still wanted an outlet, not when it hurt so much he couldn't breathe. A single fear consumed him, tearing down his walls, ripping him to pieces and stoking the rage, that his brother was going to suffer the same painful fate as he had. Chapter 13. Enyo didn't take her eyes off the sun-kissed terracotta roofs of the white city that sprawled below her on the side of Mount Olympus as her brothers swept into the room, the gentle patter of feet that accompanied the heavier thuds of his boots telling her that his usual entourage was with him. Ares didn't go anywhere without at least 4 attendants, all of them female. They prattled on as they hurried after him, taking 2 strides for each one of his, as he strode across the colorful mosaic floor of the main room of their house. She frowned at the world beyond the window. His house. The fact the mosaic featured only him amidst the glory of an ancient battle, a war in which she had fought beside him together with Eris and her siblings, would have made it clear he viewed the palatial white marble building where she lived as his home, even if he hadn't told her that 1,000,000 times to her face. Women and men dressed in fine clothing drifted along the cobbled street far below the promontory of pale rock, upon which Ares' grand temple and home stood. A trio of females dressed in elegant pale blue, soft pink, and lilac dresses halted beneath one of the towering cypress trees that lined the broad road and glanced up, their gazes lingering as they bent their heads toward each other, no doubt speaking about the man of the house. The scent of ambrosia permeated the air as she heard the slosh of liquid behind her. Ares grunted and slammed a hand against the furniture, most likely the finely crafted wooden sideboard that acted as his bar. "This batch is good." He refilled his goblet as she turned her side to the window, adjusting her position on the elegant blue velvet chaise longue that was her favorite perch. He strode into view. Sunlight streamed in through the window where she sat, bathing his tanned skin as he came to a halt in front of her. The warm rays glinted off the gold plates of his greaves and vambraces, and the pointed slats that hung from his thick gold belt. The white leather those slats were mounted on and the pale blue cloth that hung beneath them to hide his upper thighs and give him a modicum of dignity were both splattered with crimson. Her brother had been brawling again. She idly toyed with the 3 braids on the left side of her long black hair, pretending she hadn't noticed that he had been off getting into fights and whoring himself while she had been left to do the work at the temple, greeting and tending to pilgrims who had come to see him, and who were inevitably disappointed to be seen by her instead. The twittering group of aides that constantly followed him lingered just beyond him, watching him closely. She didn't recognize some of their faces. Her brother had an appetite for war and for sex, and the whole of Olympus knew that securing a position within his circle of attendants was a surefire way of getting bedded by him. She swore he went through a new set of aides every week, discarding and replacing them when he grew bored of what they had to offer. Sometimes she was sure her brother didn't have a heart to give, or perhaps he had already given it to himself. The golden-haired male grinned at her, his blue eyes brightening with it. She waited because he obviously had something he wanted to tell her, and he wanted her to ask him about it, playing the doting sister, and she wasn't really in the mood today. When she said nothing, he shoved his gold goblet at one of the females and unlatched his rich blue cloak. It dropped to the mosaic floor, and another attendant was swift to stoop and gather it into her arms before backing away from him. Ares grumbled as he unfastened the leather straps of his golden chest piece, removed it, and inspected a dent in the molded metal that had been crafted to mimic his body, a body he now proudly displayed as he turned to his aides, causing a wave of blushing and heated glances at his muscular torso. "Take this to the blacksmith. I want it repaired immediately." His deep voice rolled through the room with authority as he held his breastplate out with one hand and snatched his goblet back with the other. "Leave us." All 4 females immediately obeyed. Ares lapped it up, his twisted smirk telling her how much he enjoyed having the females do his bidding without question, leaping to execute whatever order he gave them. When his blue gaze shifted back to her, that satisfied edge melted into something akin to disappointment. because as the centuries they had lived together progressed, his dominating nature had begun to chafe, and she had begun to defy him.
You do not ask me for news from Olympus. It is not like you to not want to know the rumors spreading through the city.
Ares quaffed his ambrosia, a twinkle entering his eyes as he studied her over the rim of the goblet.
You seem out of spirits since the last war in the mortal realm ended.
Not at all.
Enyo smoothed her black skirt down as she shifted her legs over the side of her seat and sat up.
It is a little too warm for my taste today, and I am tired.
Unlike her brother, she didn't feel the need to wear her full armor when in Olympus. Her black leather and silver breastplate and matching boots were enough protection for her. She glanced back over her shoulder. It wasn't as if anyone would dare attack her in Ares' home, after all. She couldn't remember the last time he had allowed her to venture into the city without him plastered to her side, there to take whatever gratitude was offered to them for their assistance in wars and disputes, stealing every drop of it for himself.
Hermes has been getting into trouble again.
Ares sank into a throne-like armchair on the other side of the low wooden table to her and swirled his ambrosia, a thoughtful look on his handsome face as he pursed his lips.
Morpheus has been off causing trouble in dreams again. Predatory bastard. Apparently this time he targeted many Nereids.
Enyo wanted to snort at that. Her brother had the gall to call Morpheus predatory because he had been inserting himself into the dreams of the sea nymphs. Ares had tried to insert himself into their lives countless times, had stalked the most beautiful of them, and had managed to convince many of them to open their thighs to him.
And the underworld is in an uproar, of course.
Enyo jerked to attention, her jade eyes fixing on her brother. The glint in his blue eyes told her that he had known she would react to the mention of that realm, and that he was going to torment her by drawing out this news because she wanted to hear it.
Ares,
she whispered, imploring him, not above begging him now. Her heart drummed a sickening rhythm against her breast, and she fought to calm it, aware that if Ares noticed the urgent tick of her pulse, that he would only make this more agonizing for her.
What news comes from the underworld?
Ares hiked his bare shoulders and crossed his legs as he eased back in his chair. Her lips compressed, anger spiking in her blood and igniting a hunger to leap at him and force him to answer her. His wicked smile said he had sensed that in her too. Before she could warn him not to torment her, he spoke.
The third-born of Hades has re-entered the realm, apparently in pursuit of a demon. Hades has legions hunting for the male.
Escher. Escher had once again ignored the terms of his banishment, but this time to hunt down a demon. One of their enemy? It worried her. She knew Hades. She knew the weight of what Escher had done, along with everything else, rested firmly upon Charis's shoulders. She couldn't imagine the pressure he was under now. Her dark eyebrows furrowed as she thought about him, about how Hades would expect him to take full responsibility for whatever mayhem Escher caused in the underworld, and for any harm the demon caused in that realm too. The pressing need she had been fighting for the last few months returned stronger than ever, pushing her to do something, to help Charis.
A demon has breached the gates. That is war, brother, and—
She cut herself off when Ares narrowed bright blue eyes on her.
Our hands are bound, I'm afraid.
He twirled the goblet in his right hand, his face a calm mask, not a single trace of concern touching it.
Hades made it very clear that we are not to interfere. This war has nothing to do with Olympians like us.
She bit her tongue, hating the way he drew that line between her and Charis. He had never liked her friendship with the firstborn of Hades and Persephone, and he had done everything in his power to force them apart. And she hated him for it, just as she despised herself for letting him succeed. She should have been stronger. She should have stood up for herself and what she wanted. She twisted away from him and stared out of the window, desperate to occupy her mind with something else. Anything else to stop her from saying something to her brother. Speaking her mind when she was pushed to her limit like this was never wise. She had done it once, and only once. Because Ares had locked her in the pitch-black basement of the house for a full lunar cycle and forbidden anyone to go to her, not even to give her food or water. He had gone to war, and when he had returned, she had been starving, out of her mind and weak with hunger. Even immortals like her could starve given enough time. She had been so desperate for food when Ares had unlocked the door that she had promised she would never speak out of turn to him again. He had patted her head and told her that he would hold her to it, and if she broke her promise, he would destroy what she held most dear. His cold smile had told her that he knew what that was. Karis.
"You are quiet,"
Ares said and pushed onto his feet, the metal of his boots clunking against the tiles as he crossed the room. More ambrosia flowed into his goblet. Gods, she would kill for a cup to quieten her nerves. She was trying to wean herself off it again, though.
"We are gods of war, brother,"
she murmured, watching two red birds as they flitted over the terracotta rooftops of the sprawl of buildings below her, moving from one tree-shaded courtyard to the next. They joined a flock in one garden and danced in the hot, still air, some of them landing on the white statues that stood at the marble edges of many of the rooftops. Lucky, carefree birds, able to come and go as they pleased, free to do as they wished. She watched them from her gilded cage, a pang of envy lancing her heart.
"Should we not be a part of this battle?"
He huffed, but his voice was level and calm, as close to tender as he ever got when he replied,
"We are gathering information to give to Hades, and therefore his sons. That is enough."
It wasn't enough for her. She twisted onto her feet and swept her onyx hair back from her face, battling a fierce wave of nerves.
"You seem restless, sister."
Ares planted his backside against the wooden sideboard and crossed his legs at his ankles, his gaze narrowing on her as he studied her closely.
"I think I've stayed inside too long today. I need some air."
She smiled and crushed her nerves, aware he would sense them if she allowed them to keep running rampant. He would know what she was going to do. As it was, his eyes narrowed further, drilling into her.
"I hope you do not intend to leave Olympus."
She was quick to shake her head, keeping her features schooled as she said,
"Not at all. I was going to take a turn in the garden. The lilacs are blooming, and you know how much I love them."
Suspicion glimmered in his blue irises. She canted her head.
"Besides, I believe I hear your aides returning, and I am sure you have many other tasks you wish to discuss with them."
The twist of his lips and the banked heat that shimmered in his gaze said that he did. He waved her away.
"No further than the garden."
She dipped her head and swept away from him, past the four females as they bustled into the room, not drawing a single breath until she cleared the tall white columns that supported the roof and broke out onto the grand terrace that overlooked the southern slope of the mountain, a view that stretched all the way to the glittering azure sea. She paused and focused behind her on Ares, reassuring herself that he was suitably occupied before she hurried to her right. She crossed the patio, dipping her head to the two guards who stood to attention, and reached the olive trees that formed a lush wall between the terrace and the garden. Enyo followed her favorite path deep into the garden, to a similar terrace with a pergola covered in lilac blooms. She stopped at the ornate marble balustrade and pressed her palms against it as she stared into the distance, west towards the point near the shore where the gate between Olympus and the underworld stood. A gate she had used countless times over the centuries. A gate she hadn't passed through for 200 years. She ached for those halcyon days, wished with all her heart that she could bring them back again, even when she knew that was impossible. Everything had changed 200 years ago, and there was no way to put things back to how they had been. But she could patch them up, and hopefully it would be enough to set her back on the path she had wanted to take in her life. She focused and teleported, disappearing in a swirl of white-blue smoke, slammed into something solid as she reappeared and sent it toppling forwards.
"Gods damn it!"
Merrick snarled and jerked his left shoulder backwards, dislodging her. He pivoted to face her, his handsome face etched with darkness that reigned in his earthy eyes, too. When he saw it was her, he huffed and shoved his unruly brown hair out of his face.
"I really don't need this."
Enyo scowled at him. She hadn't failed to notice that over the last few months, Merrick had become increasingly less respectful towards her. She opened her mouth to pick him up on it and warn him to show her more respect, as she normally did, but snapped it closed when Merrick turned his back on her again and bent over. And she noticed he was packing. He carefully layered clothes into a suitcase on his double bed, along with some other personal items. She backed up a step and looked around the spacious main living area of the Spanish villa. His books were gone from the coffee table, and there was no sign of his female.
"You are leaving?"
she said with a glance at him. He shut the lid on the suitcase and zipped it closed.
Moving into Tokyo. It was Daimon's idea. Things are getting... It's better we're all in one place together.
Enyo didn't like the sound of that.
"Esha has returned?"
Merrick looked over his shoulder at her and slowly straightened, coming to face her.
No. You know about him?
She nodded.
"Brother told me."
Before he could ask her something else, such as requesting she leave him alone as he normally did, she continued.
"Ares tells me that we will not be allowed to participate in the coming war. Hades forbids it."
Merrick's face darkened and he grunted.
Sounds like father.
Enyo lifted her hand, stopped herself from reaching for Merrick's arm, and flexed her fingers.
"Is there nothing you can do?"
She swallowed and steeled her nerves.
"Keris can do, to change Hades' mind."
Merrick's rich brown eyes warmed, because she had dared to speak of Keris for once rather than dancing around things. She was tired of trying to suppress her feelings, tired of letting her fear control her. She needed to know he was going to be all right. Merrick shrugged, shoved the suitcase aside, and dragged an empty one across the bed to him.
I doubt it. You know our father. Hades is set in his ways, and his word is absolute.
That worried her. If Keris couldn't convince Hades to allow Olympians to participate in the war, he would be at a disadvantage, and her brother would force her to remain on the sidelines, stopping her from helping him.
How does Keris fare?"
She curled her fingers into fists at her sides, battling another bout of nerves, as she stared at Merrick's broad back, waiting for him to tell her to ask his brother herself.
I think he's feeling the pressure now.
Merrick paused halfway through folding his shirt and set it down, concern shining in his eyes as he looked over his shoulder at her.
He's more distant than usual, and he's decided to remain in Paris rather than come to Tokyo with the rest of us.
Fear arrowed through her. He would be vulnerable alone.
Ares, my brother Ares, he messaged to say he's trying to change Keris's mind. But you know Keris.
Merrick smiled solemnly.
He's as stubborn as our father.
She knew that all too well.
"Speak to him. Try to convince him that moving to Tokyo is the wise thing to do. He will listen to you if you all work together. I know it."
He sighed, a weary edge to it and his eyes as he scrubbed a hand over his hair.
I'll try. We'll try.
He frowned and looked down, reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a device. The screen illuminated his face and then darkened, and he lifted his gaze to lock with hers.
I have to go. Keris wants a meeting.
Enyo tensed, stopping herself as an urge to ask to go with him whipped through her.
I'll speak to him,
Merrick said. She dipped her head and forced herself to leave, before she did something foolish like teleporting to Tokyo. She landed back on the small terrace, the scent of lilac swirling around her in the warm breeze. Her heart remained heavy as she stared at the distant shimmering gate, and she told herself she was doing the right thing. Her brother would be furious with her if he found her missing. Her brother was right, too. This wasn't her fight. Joining the battle now would only result in her brother and Hades being furious with her. She plucked a bloom from the ones that hung to her left, running down the column of the pergola to the wall. She lifted it to her nose as she thought about Keris, about how she had stood with him in this very spot once, seemingly a lifetime ago now. It had been night, and the full moon had kissed the sea and the city, revealing all to her. The streets and houses had been dotted with the golden glow of torchlight, and the cool breeze had been heavy with the scent of flowers. Laughter had rung in the air, coming from all around her, loudest at her back where her brother had been hosting a grand party to celebrate Anthesteria, a festival focused on wine, and one which most of Olympus used as an excuse to get drunk for 3 days. She had been taking a break from the merriment and had come to the secluded terrace, and Keris had joined her. She had lingered, enjoying his company, and he had spotted the first bloom of the lilac and plucked it for her. When he had tucked it behind her ear and told her the flower suited her, it had become her favorite. They had spent the whole night talking, until the sun had broken the horizon and the sound of merriment had been replaced with snoring, among other wicked things, and she had grown tired. She turned her back to the city and looked at the marble bench set in a leafy alcove opposite her, the very same seat where she had fallen asleep with her head on Karis's shoulder, his rich masculine scent overshadowing the subtler fragrance of the flowers, sending her into dreams of him, dreams she had hoped would become reality. Enyo closed her eyes and shut out the past, switching her focus back to the future, because if she didn't do something, that dream she'd had would never become real. Merrick's words troubled her. Was Karis trying to lure the enemy out by remaining in Paris, or perhaps goad them? He was strong, but he wasn't invulnerable. She had witnessed that plenty of times when they had sparred, or when he had fought in the festivities that often took place in the underworld or Olympus, tests of strength in grand arenas. It wasn't like him to be so reckless. She opened her eyes and stared at the bench. She had to do something. Her heart screamed that at her. For the second time in her life, she was truly afraid. Last time, she had feared she would never see Karis again. Now, she was afraid of facing him. Chapter 14. Cass walked to the couch, waving away Mari as she hurried to help her. She wasn't an invalid. Her strength was already returning, steadily flowing back into her. She just needed a few moments off her feet. 3 of the brothers left, leaving Ava and Katerina and Ares behind. Ares guided Megan to the couch and settled her beside Cass, a wealth of worry in his dark eyes as he looked her over. Ava and Katerina fell into conversation in the middle of the room, drifting towards the dining table as they discussed the pros and cons of living in the Tokyo mansion with everyone else. The cons list was far longer than the pros. Daimon remained where he was as Cal came to Mari, and they slumped onto the other couch together, facing the wall that separated the TV area from the corridor outside Cal's room. Cass looked down at Megan's baby bump, tried to imagine herself pregnant. She just couldn't picture it, even when she knew it would happen sooner rather than later. She wasn't really getting a choice about that. She had put things off for long enough, and the coven was getting annoyed with her now. Her time was up. Tradition was about to take the reins in her life, and there wasn't anything she could do about it. She still wasn't sure how she felt about it all, putting her life on hold for a year or more, bearing a child for the coven, leaving it there to be raised by them.
What's it like?
Cass had avoided learning about pregnancy, had buried her head in the sand, some part of her believing it would never happen to her. Her maternal instincts weren't exactly strong. Milos was her baby and she doted on him, and she loved Mari with all her heart and would do anything for her. Did that mean she would feel some degree of hurt when she gave up her child? Megan settled her hands on her stomach as Ares kneeled before her, rubbing her thighs through her jeans.
I'm sick more than I'm not. I'm tired all the time. I get awful sleep. I have the weirdest cravings.
Ares grinned at Cass.
She really does.
Doting idiot. He looked as if the entire world revolved around the woman before him.
Can I know some women don't like it, but could I touch it?
Cass glanced at Daimon as she asked that. A mistake. A thought pinged into her head. Would he ever look at her the way Ares looked at Megan? Did she want him to? Her heart whispered the answer. She did.
Sure.
Megan shifted her hands aside. Cass gingerly placed her palm against the top of Megan's belly. Power curled through her, emanating not from Megan but from the baby growing inside her. She focused on it, and a smile teased her lips against her will.
She's strong,
she whispered, glancing at Megan, who went awfully still. Megan's chocolate eyes slowly widened and edged toward Ares.
She?
Ares teared up like a fool.
A little girl.
Megan choked on what Cass hoped was a happy sob, covering her mouth with her hand.
Oh, gods, you didn't know,
Cass blurted. Was it too late to backpedal and say she always referred to babies with the female pronoun? Ares grinned. Megan laughed, a little hysterically.
I told you there was more than one sex.
Ares ran a shaky hand over his overlong tawny hair, his smile fading.
Shit, a little girl.
He looked as if he didn't know whether to be deliriously happy or absolutely terrified. Megan's face fell.
We'll keep her safe.
And it dawned on Cass. Ares feared his daughter would suffer the same horrible fate that his sister had.
She is strong,
Cass palmed Megan's belly.
very strong, forged by flame like her father. But she will be kind-hearted like her mother.
Katerina and Ava joined the group, all smiles. Callistos moved in to crowd Megan with Mari, and Cass turned to look at Ares. Her gaze caught on Daimon. He still stood in the same place, his eyes holding that pain she hated seeing in them as he stared at Megan and Ares. Why? It wasn't because he couldn't touch someone the way Ares was touching Megan, because he could touch her if he would only allow himself that pleasure. So what was holding him back? Why did he look so hurt as he watched her touching Megan's belly, when everyone else looked so ridiculously happy about the situation? He turned his cheek to her and walked into the garden without a word. Cass watched him go, the joy of the moment fading into concern that ate away at her, had her filling with a need to rise and follow him. She pushed onto her feet and trailed after Daimon, following the stepping stones that wound between the manicured pine topiary and the central courtyard. Moonlight bathed the garden beyond, shining on Daimon where he sat on a boulder on the far side of the koi pond. Cass stilled and watched him. He stared at his bare upturned palm, his gaze distant. Miniature ice sculptures formed on his hand. Was he aware of the shapes he was making with his power? He looked as if he was staring straight through them, lost in thought and unaware of the world around him. She edged closer, proving that to herself when he didn't stir, not even when she reached the arched wooden bridge that spanned the pond. The air was colder here, had her breath fogging in front of her face, and she looked at Daimon's feet, unsurprised to see frost flowers blooming across the boulder. Whatever he was thinking about, it was upsetting him. The ice melted and then reformed, taking on the shape of a woman. Her? The belly of the curvy figure swelled. Megan? No emotion touched his face as he ran a lone finger over the belly of the woman, but Cass could feel the turmoil beating in his heart. A sorrowful edge crossed his features as he continued to touch the ice sculpture, as he lifted his hand and stroked her face. There was affection in that caress. His mouth moved, his whispers so low she couldn't hear what he was saying to the woman. In response, the ice sculpture shifted, touching her stomach first and then extending her arms towards Daimon. His shoulders tensed beneath his turtleneck, and he drew a shaky breath and then released it, shuddering as he did so. He whispered something else. The statue shattered, raining shards of ice like diamonds onto the rocks at his feet. She should go. She knew that deep in her heart. But that same heart needed to know the things Daimon wouldn't tell her, the things he had buried deep. The cause of the barrier he kept lifting between them, the source of the pain that often shone in his eyes. Cass told herself again to go, not to intrude when he clearly needed some time alone. But she couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't ignore the burning need to know why he was sitting alone with an ice sculpture of a pregnant woman.
"You're a very talented artist,"
she whispered, afraid of disturbing him, unsure how he would react. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything.
"Is it someone you know?"
She braved a step closer and rubbed her arms to keep the chill off them as the temperature dropped another few degrees. He barely dipped his head in response, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the melting ice fragments around his feet. She had never seen someone look so alone, so lonely, so in need of someone to hold them together. Cass wanted to be the one to reach out and hold him, to wrap her arms around his strong shoulders, and ask him to tell her about the pain he was holding caged in his heart. All this time around her, he had looked strong, almost invincible, even when pain had shown in his eyes. Now he looked so vulnerable, and she couldn't bear it.
"Is she waiting for you back home?"
she murmured. No. A shaky inward breath. Yes. Which was it? She looked at the ice littered around his feet, and it dawned on her. His home was the underworld. The woman was dead. That was why she was there, waiting for him still. Her experience of consoling people boiled down to taking care of Mari when they had lost Eric, and Eric when Mari's mother had died during childbirth. She wasn't sure she had done a good job on either of those occasions. She wanted to console Daimon, but feared she would only make things worse. That fear held her back, had her keeping her distance when all she really wanted to do was hold him. She looked down at the melting ice. Had Daimon's woman died in childbirth?
She was beautiful.
Cass wasn't sure whether hearing that from her would make him feel better or worse. He was silent for so long that she was on the verge of leaving him alone when he finally spoke. It wasn't a true representation of her. Maybe the woman hadn't been so beautiful. He lifted his head, his pale eyes hollow and cold, bleak and edged with darkness. She wasn't showing when demons killed her and our unborn child. Before she could ask about it, before she could even think to reach for his hand to comfort him, he was gone, only swirling black smoke left behind. Twin emotions filled her heart. Jealousy that he had loved this woman and still mourned her, clearly wished she was still alive, and he'd had the family they had been building together. Sorrow that he had gone through something so terrible, still lived with the pain it had caused, allowing it to fester inside him. Gravel crunched off to her right, and she looked there. The lights from the mansion threw Merrick's bulky figure into silhouette, stealing his features from her until he drew close enough that the slender moonlight revealed them to her. Karis wants to talk about potentially closing another gate. His dark eyes slid to the lingering ribbons of smoke. Where's Daimon?
He left.
She meant to leave it at that, but then she blurted,
What happened to Daimon's wife?
Merrick's dark eyebrows knitted hard. Wife? Daimon has never been married. There was Penelope. She was killed before Father sent us here. Why? She told herself not to say anything more. Her mouth moved anyway.
I found him making ice sculptures. One of them was of her, I think. She was pregnant, right?
Shock danced across Merrick's face. Pregnant? She nodded and inwardly cursed. How many times tonight was she going to reveal things that were unknown or clearly a secret in this case? She needed to learn to watch her mouth.
You never knew,
she said. Merrick shook his head. None of us did. Daimon never told us. He's never spoken about what happened. Penelope lived in the mortal world, and I knew he'd been seeing her, but nothing about his behavior ever led me to believe things were serious between them. He would go and visit her from time to time, leaving weeks between each trip. Normally, it was when he grew bored of the females who regularly visited Father's estate. I always thought he had just been mixing things up. Mixing things up? Was Merrick right and Daimon hadn't been serious about Penelope? Maybe his brother was wrong. Daimon had clearly loved this woman, mourned her still, and Cass had figured out Penelope was the reason he kept guarding his heart, refusing her advances. He had said his heart belonged to another.
He never seemed serious about her.
Cass couldn't stop that question from leaving her lips. Need to know more about Daimon and this woman, pushing her to discover all Merrick knew about the two of them. Merrick shrugged. Perhaps. Towards the end. Maybe in the month or so before her death. After Penelope must have told Daimon she was pregnant. Someone called to Merrick.
I'll make excuses for Daimon. Keep this between us?
Cass didn't want the others discovering the things Daimon wanted to keep secret. It was his place to tell his brothers, not hers. Merrick nodded and went back inside. Cass lingered on the bridge, her gaze lowering to the boulder where Daimon had sat. She replayed what she had seen, how he had looked at her. This was the reason he took care of the children in Hong Kong, another secret he kept from his brothers. A shiver chased through her. Beneath his frosty exterior, there was a warm heart, and it was broken, shattered just like the ice sculpture. And all this time she had been pushing him, hadn't taken his rejection seriously, had kept prodding and poking him and trying to tear down his defenses, unable to believe there might be a reason other than the manifestation of his power behind why he didn't want to get involved with her. A reason that had been festering inside him all this time. She straightened as resolve filled her, the need to make amends a driving force behind it. She was going to help him come to terms with what had happened to the woman he loved and his unborn child, so one day he would finally be able to love again, to live again, without remorse or guilt. Not for her sake, but for his. She would be long gone by the time he was finally ready to take the leap and be with another woman. She could only hope that he would be happy at last, that one of them could be happy. She looked down at herself, sorrow and sickness washing through her, stirred by a wish that she cast aside before it could fully form, because it was impossible. Allowing herself to feel something for Daimon would only cause her pain in the long run. Believing Daimon could come to love her would only destroy her. Happiness was far beyond her reach. Fate had other plans for her. Chapter 15. Daimon stepped back to the Tokyo mansion, landing near the porch. Sunlight bathed the building and the grounds, the air still and silent. Just as he had hoped, everyone would be asleep and he could avoid them all, at least for a few more hours. He toed his boots off, taking his time about it, his thoughts slowing him down. He wasn't sure what he was going to say to Cass when he saw her again. His guard had been down in that moment by the bridge, and things had slipped out, things he had always wanted to keep secret. Or at least he thought he wanted to keep them secret. He would never admit it to her, but talking to her about Penelope, even for that brief moment, had lifted some of the weight from his shoulders. He had been in a foul mood when he had left, had returned to Hong Kong and cursed her 1,000 times over, but once he had realized he wasn't really angry, that he was only acting out because he felt he should be furious, he had felt good. He had never realized that Penelope was a sword hanging over him, a weight that constantly pressed down on him. He had loved her, or at least he had grown to love her, and he truly believed that if she hadn't been killed, he could have been happy with her. Guilt stirred, but he pushed it away, unwilling to let it take hold. He had been loyal to Penelope from the moment she had announced she was pregnant, had made the decision to stand by her, and he had stood by her for decades after her death, believing doing so would make him happy. But it hadn't. And when he had been sent to this world and his power had manifested, he had driven deep into that desire to remain faithful to her, using it to shield himself from the pain of being unable to touch another without potentially killing them. He had fooled himself. Cass had opened his eyes. Cass, who had looked so wounded last night, as if her heart had been bleeding for him. He wasn't the only one who had revealed something about themselves last night. Cass had too. Beneath her often cold exterior, she cared. She cared deeply. She only affected the air of someone who didn't form attachments, who expected everyone to do their bidding without question, and who didn't care what others thought of her. He set his boots on the rack, still mulling over how he was going to approach her once evening rolled around and everyone in the mansion woke up. Daimon pushed the door open and a sweet, tempting aroma hit him. He tracked it to the kitchen, paused when a muttered curse broke the silence, and then edged forwards. He peered into the kitchen. It was a mess. Bowls and tools were scattered all over the surfaces. Bags and tubs of ingredients filled the spaces between them, and there was flour on almost everything. He froze again. Cass hummed as she bent over and removed something from the oven, the cute cat-paw gloves out of place with an outfit he could only describe as a real heart-stopper. Black leather molded to her long legs, the trousers riding low enough that it exposed a strip of creamy-toned stomach between them and the fitted ribbed black corset she wore. Heat rushed through Daimon, his blood raging at the sight of her, his mouth going dry as he drank his fill of her curves, and kept on picturing her as she had been in the bath, clad in only revealing underwear. "What are you doing?" He squeezed the words out, struggling to think, let alone speak, as he attempted to banish underwear Cass from his mind. She whirled to face him, straightening at the same time and almost dropping the black deep metal tray she clutched.
"Are you in the habit of sneaking up on people?"
He shrugged that off. "You should have been able to sense I was back." She averted her gaze, lowering it to the pan she held.
"My powers are a bit low right now."
He frowned at that. How much of her powers had she had to put into that barrier to make it that effective? He took a good look at her, shutting out her tempting curves and wicked outfit, keeping his gaze trained on her face. She looked tired, dark circles around her eyes, her skin still a shade paler than before. "You should be resting," he bit out, harder than he had meant, earning a frown from her. He braced himself, waiting for her to mention again that she didn't like people ordering her around. Instead of lashing out at him, she muttered,
I can't. There's too much going on in my head. So here I am, baking.
Baking. It seemed like such a homely thing to do, so domestic and old-world feminine. Words he had never thought he would apply to her. There was a side to her she kept hidden from the world, a side that she evidently hadn't wanted anyone to witness, judging by how awkward she looked as she glanced at him. "Do you like to bake?" He leaned his hip and shoulder against the doorframe, gunning for casual to cover how eager he was to know more about her, about this side of her in particular. She set the rectangular pan down on a rack on the counter to his left and wafted the dark brown contents with a baking sheet.
Only when I'm stressed.
He couldn't imagine her being stressed that often back home on the island. If he lived there, he would never be stressed. All that sunshine, sea, and endless blue sky. He always had found the quiet life appealing. Cass took a plate from the cupboard, picked up a slice of something from a tray beside the one she had been fanning, and offered it to him.
Brownie? It's a new recipe I'm trying. Guaranteed to make you feel good.
Daimon stared at the square of chocolate cake and held his hands up. If by good you mean bouncing off the walls and probably causing an ice storm, then sure. She frowned at him, a puzzled edge to her blue eyes. I can't have caffeine. There's caffeine in chocolate. Enough that I may or may not go off the rails. Personally, I don't want to risk finding out which it would be. When she just continued to stare at him, he added, None of us can have caffeine. It's like alcohol and mortal drugs. All very bad things and strictly forbidden. She looked disappointed to hear that as she lowered her gaze to the slice.
I thought I knew you all better, but all the information I gathered never revealed you and your brothers can't have caffeine.
Or maybe she was irritated with herself. She huffed.
There's so much I didn't know about you.
He knew she was talking about him specifically now. Before he could overcome how strange it felt to want to talk about his past and say anything about what she had witnessed, she continued.
What will I do with all these brownies?
She gazed longingly at them, revealing she had an idea what to do with them. Aiko and the others would probably love them. They need a pick-me-up right now. The longing edge to her gaze only grew stronger as she muttered,
Everyone does. I'd eat them all, but a moment on the lips.
She patted her hips, her very shapely hips. Surprise claimed him when he was tempted to say she would only look better with a little more flesh on her curves. The words refused to leave his lips, dying quickly when he recalled the letter he had seen on her desk and the way she had touched Megan's belly and asked about pregnancy. She was meant for someone else, destined to bear his child. He twisted and eased his backside against the counter, watched her in silence as she leafed through a cookery book, muttering things to herself about recipes without chocolate. The silence felt comfortable even as it cut at him, filling his head with thoughts of Cass with some nameless, faceless man. Milos graced him with a hiss as he strolled past and glared at him as he wound around Cass's ankles. She blew kisses at the raggedy tomcat, her voice light and airy, as if she was talking to a baby.
What kind of baked goods do gods like, Milos?
The cat meowed sweetly, and then issued another glare at Daimon when Cass went back to the book. Unwilling to have a cat of all things steal her attention away from him, Daimon said, I have a sweet tooth. She looked across at him, her eyebrows rising.
You do?
He nodded. I like rice cakes. I go to Asakasa sometimes to stroll along the stalls and buy some. The local gods don't like me treading on their turf, but they've never tried to kick me off. They have more of a problem with Escher. The light that had been in his voice, that had been filling him, faded as he thought about his brother. Where was he? He stared at the cupboards opposite him, the temptation to force Cal to open a portal for him growing again. Cass's voice broke into his thoughts.
What else do you like?
He glanced at her, saw in her eyes that she had noticed the change in his mood and was trying to distract him. Mooncakes, mochi, he offered, and tried to think of something she would be able to make with the ingredients scattered around the kitchen. Victoria sponge cake.
That was a little left field.
She frowned at him. My brothers like it too. And you have all the ingredients right here.
Oh, so you picked something I could make. Heaven forbid the women get all these sweet things and the gods don't get any offerings.
She looked as if she wanted to tease him some more and then picked up a bag of flour.
Very well, but I warn you, I make the very best Victoria sponge cake. Every one you have after today will be pale in comparison.
Daimon shrugged, one that felt so easy that it surprised him, together with the smile that curled his lips. Unless I get you to make another sometime. She looked at him, suddenly serious, and his smile faded as the light that had been filling him again switched off. Her blue gaze dropped to her work as she picked out a clean bowl and gathered ingredients.
I like sweet things too. I always got along well with Eric because of it. He made the best sweet treats. Chocolates to die for. The man was a genius. I really missed that once Mari grew up and was old enough to notice I don't age like others. Eric would send me boxes of chocolates from time to time, but it wasn't the same as sitting in his shop eating whatever I wanted as we talked.
It took Daimon a moment to remember who Eric was, and even when he did, it didn't stop him from feeling jealous. The sparkle in her eyes as she spoke of Eric told Daimon that she had loved him. It was ridiculous of Daimon to be jealous of a dead man, but he couldn't help it. The possessive side of him wanted her all to himself, didn't want to share her with anyone, dead or alive. He reminded himself that it didn't matter what he wanted. She wasn't destined to be his. He had come here ready to speak with her, to brave the next step and give in to his attraction to her. But now that he was near her again, he couldn't stop thinking about the letter. How was he meant to give in to her when he knew another man was waiting for her? How could she want him when she already had someone? Was she really only flirting with him, not expecting him to do anything about it? Enjoying the rush of attempting to break down his walls? Or was she serious about him? If she was, did that mean she wasn't serious about the man waiting for her? His thoughts spun in circles in his mind, gathering speed, becoming a dizzying blur that had him unsure which direction he was going, but aware that danger lay ahead. Her coven had been serious about her returning and bearing a child. Daimon had grown up in a world where goddesses were often betrothed from birth, their family deciding who they would marry. Had Cass's coven done the same with her, selecting the man she would be with and expecting her to follow through with it? Would she follow through with it? She glanced at him, the feel of her eyes on his face only strengthening the storm building inside him. He had come here wanting to give in to her, but now he wasn't sure he could do it. He wasn't sure he could get over what he had learned about her, or the thought she was destined for another man. He needed to drive that home so he would stop forgetting it before he did something stupid, like falling for her. It was going to hurt like hell, but it was better to wound himself now than let her utterly destroy him when she left. "You're good at this." He waited for her to look at him again, cursed her for smiling at him and looking happy that he had complimented her when he wasn't done. He felt like a bastard when he added in a casual tone that hid everything he was feeling. "You'll make a good mother." Her head jerked up, her gaze colliding hard with his.
What do you mean by that?
Her pulse was off the scale. She knew exactly what he meant, and the fact that she did turned his stomach, had cold sweeping through him as his mood darkened. Daimon shoved his feelings down and forced himself to continue, driving the wedge between them deeper. "I saw the letter on your desk." Chapter 16. Cass cursed Daimon in Russian, a whole string of them, every single one she could call to mind. He deserved all of them as he stood there, casual as anything, his expression flat and empty, concealing all of his feelings from her. She wished she could do the same, masking the anger and hurt that swamped her, the fierce need to explain things even when she knew that whatever she said, it wasn't going to make things better. He had already made up his mind about her and what he had read.
You snooped at my private things,
she snapped once she could say something that wasn't a swear word. It was right there. He folded his arms across his chest, the navy roll-neck long-sleeve t-shirt he wore tightening over his muscles as they flexed. It was pretty hard to miss, a little like the bite in his tone. He had read the letter the coven had sent to her. That was the reason he had turned so frosty with her back at her home, had announced he was leaving with or without her, and had been flip-flopping between pulling her closer and pushing her away more rapidly than before. He was jealous, even when there was no need to feel that way. He was angry, too. It flashed in his eyes as his irises brightened, turning as white as snow ringed with black, flecked with diamonds. Besides, you've done your share of snooping. He threw the words at her. She planted her hands on her hips but couldn't deny that. Just because she might have poked her nose in here and there didn't mean she didn't get to be angry when he did the same thing. She wanted to lash out at him, slave to a powerful urge to slap him for looking at the letter she had discarded on her desk the moment she had opened it, tossing it aside without reading it when she had seen the Coven letterhead. It would only make things worse, and she ached for things to be better, back to how they had been before he had turned cold towards her. Only a minute ago, things had been good between them, better than they had ever been, and she had been enjoying it. For a moment, she had honestly believed he was close to giving in to her. Now he was so far away from her that she felt like a fool for thinking something was about to happen between them. She nibbled the corner of the brownie she had cut for him, needing the sugar and the sweet fix, a dose of chocolate to keep her spirits up and maybe give her a little courage. She should have kept the ambrosia on hand in the kitchen, regretted taking it to her quarters now.
It's tradition.
That word sounded cold, hollow, no doubt revealing how she felt about it. She was done hiding things from Daimon, though. He might be happy switching emotions every minute and keeping everything to himself, but she wasn't. He was the only one who knew what awaited her, and gods, she needed to talk to someone about it, even when there was a chance she was only going to do more damage to the fragile bond that had been developing between them. If she was lucky, it would both lift some of the weight from her shoulders and make him see that she wasn't really getting a choice.
When a witch in my coven reaches 200 years old, they must return home to bear a child, with what you and your brothers call a hellspawn. The child will be female and a witch. It's the way of our coven.
It sounded so sterile when she put it like that, and she wanted it to be that way. What she didn't tell him was that she had been putting it off. She was loyal to her coven and planned to obey the summons eventually. But first, she needed to be sure Mari would be safe, and she needed to keep her promise to Eric. You seem all right with this. Daimon sounded bitter, his deep voice colder than she had ever heard it, and the air around him chilled a few degrees.
It's tradition.
And she wasn't all right with it, not anymore. She wanted to tell him that, but her voice failed her. Her coven was her everything. Her family. Everyone did their part to keep it strong, and she wasn't going to be the one to break from tradition. She couldn't. But it didn't mean she didn't have her reservations, her doubts, even fears. She had never known her parents. Her loyalty to her coven and her belief in their system had been unwavering before she had met Eric and Mari had come into the world. Since then, she had often wondered if her life would have been different if she had known her parents, even just her mother. When Mari had discovered Eric wasn't her biological father, the conflict inside Cass had only grown. She had started to wish she'd had parents, a father in her life, even one who had chosen to have her as his daughter as Eric had with Mari, had chosen to raise her and love her. Seeing Mari's life from the moment she had been born, how being raised in a warm, beautiful part of France and in a loving family had shaped her into a good woman, one who was very balanced and kind, had made Cass question what she was doing even before she had been summoned by her coven on her 200th birthday. Before Eric and Mari, she had been happy to do her duty, viewing it as only a minor inconvenience in her life, a year sacrificed for the greater good of her coven. Now she couldn't imagine doing it, even when she was resolved to go through with it. Even when being around everyone in this damned house was only making her more aware of how little she knew about being part of a family. She didn't know how a family really functioned, and discovering the ups and downs of one, witnessing the love and the fighting, the reconciliations and the protectiveness of everyone in this one, was only making things harder for her. She closed her eyes and forced a confession, admitted something she had been denying, too afraid to allow herself to voice it even to herself, too afraid of how much it would hurt her. Cass opened her eyes and looked at Daimon, wishing she was brave enough to put a voice behind what she was about to admit to herself. She didn't want to bring a child into a cold world like her coven, where it would never know her, where she would have to stand by and watch her daughter grow up, never knowing who she was and not allowed to tell her either. Several witches would bear children along with her, and those babies would be given the same birth date regardless of when they had been born, and would be kept away in a nursery until they were all 1 year old. Something the coven did to ensure none of the mothers knew which one was their child. A battle raged inside her, fiercer than ever, a war between duty and desire. She owed her coven everything. They had raised her, taught her all she needed to know to succeed in the world, and had given her the freedom she had desired, passing contracts to her that had kept her in enough money to do as she wished, and had given her the opportunity to see the world. In return for all that, she could do this one thing, couldn't she? She stared into Daimon's eyes as they slowly softened, concern surfacing in them, and cursed him. Being around him had only made things harder for her. The scent of snow and spice came from him, a smell that reminded her of home, but with him it wasn't cold that she felt. He made her feel warm. He made her question everything. He made her feel everything. And that was bad. She wouldn't fall for him. He was meant to be a pleasant distraction, whatever they shared, all about fulfilling lust and having fun while it lasted. But she had the terrible feeling it was too late, and he was already so much more than that to her. That the frozen heart that was melting wasn't his. It was hers. Chapter 17. Daimon grunted as he ducked and rolled, came up onto his feet, and reached beneath his left arm at the same time. He slipped his finger into the ring on the hilt of one of his throwing knives, funneled his power into it, and let it fly. It shot across the gently undulating grassy hill and nailed a demon in his shoulder. The male went down. 2 others jumped over his body and rushed Daimon. Lightning struck the one on the left. The demon exploded, showering his comrade in black blood and bits of flesh and bone, and the ground rocked as a boom echoed across the hilly landscape of Lantau Island, rolling into the pitch darkness. The second demon reached him, and Daimon threw his hand forwards, unleashing 3 spears of ice that pierced the male in his thigh, stomach, and chest at a diagonal. Daimon breathed hard as the male hit the dirt, sliding to a halt just a few feet from him. There were too many of them. He checked on his brothers, tracking Cal and Valen as they battled the demons who were attempting to keep them away from the gate, a gate which the 2 Erinyes were trying to open. A wall of demons stood between him and his brothers and the goddesses. So far, the 2 Furies had only managed to make the gate appear, at which point Daimon had felt it and had ordered Cal and Valen to come with him, while Ares remained with the women. He hadn't expected to find the Erinyes here, with at least 4 dozen demons surrounding them. He had thought they would be long gone, teasing him and his brothers again, drawing them out before running away. Gods, he was glad he had demanded Cass stay at the mansion with Mirinda. The sorceress had had a few choice things to say to him in response to that, and he knew her anger hadn't all been about him ordering her to remain where she was, sidelining her again in order to protect her from their enemy. She was still angry with him for reading the letter, and he deserved it. "I can get closer." Cal's voice broke into his thoughts, and Daimon shook his head. They couldn't risk approaching the gate, because it would open if they got any closer to it. They also couldn't risk attacking the Erinyes with any of their powers, just in case the gate was caught in the crossfire. The 2 goddesses were standing too close to it. And on top of that, they couldn't risk spilling their blood, just in case that was the reason the Erinyes had remained this time, hoping to injure one of them so they could get their hands on some of their blood. It would give them the power to open the gates again. The best thing they could do was leave, but it was their duty to protect the gates, and they couldn't leave this one vulnerable. He wasn't sure whether the Erinyes would be able to coax it open given enough time, and he wasn't about to risk it by withdrawing. One of the 2 blonde females looked over her shoulder at him, fury shining in her violet eyes. He wasn't the only one who was pissed. Were the Furies angry because he and his brothers were evading more than they were attacking, keeping the demons busy while they kept an eye on the gate to make sure nothing happened to it? Or were they angry because they had expected more than just Daimon, Cal, and Valen to show up to fight them? The central purple disk of the gate flickered, weakly glowing, and he focused on it as Valen and Cal launched another attack on the wall of demons, attempting to weaken their forces enough that the Erinyes would be forced to withdraw. Daimon struggled to focus as his thoughts kept shifting course, veering back to the angry sorceress he had left in Tokyo. One who had looked as wounded by his demand she remain there as she had by his announcement that he had seen the letter on her desk. He scrubbed a hand down his face and fixed his mind on the gate, on closing it. He felt the hum of power running through him as he connected with it, a comforting touch that boosted his strength, enough that he felt he could force it closed. If he could make it disappear, they could attack the Erinyes. He could get back to Tokyo. To that damned sorceress who had him tied in knots, going in circles, hating himself each time he completed a cycle of drawing her closer and pushing her away. He needed to get his head straight and his heart back in line. He couldn't shake how relaxed she had been with him in that cramped kitchen. She had been so open, offering smiles that had warmed the coldest parts of him, making him feel things he had no right feeling. So he had ruined it all. But gods, he had needed it out there, in the open between them. He had needed her to know that he was aware she was meant to return to her coven, to the man waiting for her. He was no longer sure whether he had been attempting to drive a wedge between them to save himself, attempting to force a confession from her, or something else. But as he stood focused on the gate, his mind emptying, his heart supplied a possible answer. He had done it because he wanted her to pick him. He wanted Cass to look at him the way Megan looked at Ares. He wanted everything his brother had, everything he had denied himself for centuries, everything he had never wanted but now craved to the point it made him crazy. And it wasn't because he could touch Cass. He had been craving her from the moment he had set eyes on her, but he couldn't have her. So he kept trying to force her away from him, even when he knew it wouldn't change how he felt. But he couldn't give in to her. This kind of feeling was going to last longer than the time he had with her. When she left, he was going to feel bad enough as it was, but if he let her get any closer, it would destroy him. He would never get over her. "Daimon, are you fucking listening?" Valen's voice broke into his thoughts, and he turned his head to his right, his gaze landing on his violet-haired brother who stood right in front of him. "This is not the time to zone out. What the hell is wrong with you?" Daimon had been asking himself that question since Cass had stormed into his life, throwing everything into disarray. He didn't have an answer to give his brother. Lightning struck all around them, shaking the hills that stretched in all directions, slender moonlight casting silver highlights on their sides and sloping peaks. Half a dozen screams rent the night air, the vile scent of demon blood thickening and choking him. Wind swept across the battlefield beyond Valen, sending another half-dozen demons crashing into each other. "I'm listening," Daimon snapped, ignoring the look Valen gave him that blatantly said his brother didn't believe him. "Get your head out of your pants," Valen barked, and reached a hand towards him, looking as if he was going to seize Daimon and shake him. He stopped just inches from him and glared instead. "Because you're fucking this all up." Valen's golden eyes dropped. Daimon looked down as warmth suddenly seeped across his stomach and hip on his left side, stared at the slick patch that was already several inches wide. He hadn't noticed someone had landed a blow on him. He growled, anger at the demon who had done this to him colliding with fury aimed at himself, for letting his mind wander during a fight. He swiftly checked the Erinyes, relieved to find they were still at the gate and were no longer focused on attempting to open it. They were struggling to defend themselves. Merrick and Karis worked as a team, using earth and shadows to drive the demons back, taking several down in the process as they fought to reach the Erinyes. The two blonde goddesses had closed ranks and were holding hands now, their bright violet eyes glowing in the darkness as they slowly backed off. Behind them, the gate shrank and winked out of existence with a violent burst of purple light that dampened Daimon's vision. Not only had he failed to notice a demon had landed a blow on him, but he had failed to notice the arrival of his brothers. He cursed Cass and then himself. Black shadows raced from Karis, screams filling the air as they cut a path through the demons, and then a keening feminine shriek. "Sister!" One of the Erinyes turned a growl on his oldest brother. "You will pay dearly for that!" But rather than attacking him, she cast a portal. The violet-black smoke rapidly billowed outwards and she backed into it, helping the other fury as she hobbled. Merrick and Cal stepped and sprinted for it, and Daimon kicked off too, determined to get his hands on one or both of the goddesses. Demons crowded the path ahead of him, and he snarled through short fangs as he threw his arms forwards. Jagged shards of ice shot up from the grass. impaling several of the demons. The rest were swift to leap out of the way. His gaze shot to the portal, and he bit out a curse. It was gone. On a black growl, he turned on the remaining demons, hurling spears of ice in rapid succession, quickly taking down 6 of them as his brothers joined the fight again. The demons didn't stand a chance. Several of them scrambled to escape, but Valen didn't let them. Lightning crashed down around them, striking half of the demons as shadows killed the rest. Daimon pressed his hand to his side and breathed hard as the last demon went down, needing a moment to gather his strength again. Cal, Valen, Karis, and Merrick picked their way over the dead to reach him, and he looked at the point where the gate was hidden. A weight settled in his gut. "I don't like what happened here," he muttered, his voice distant as his thoughts turned to Escher again. He glanced at Karis. "They attacked Hong Kong. This gate is bound to Escher, meaning it's the one gate we can't seal right now." Karis's handsome face turned grave, and he dipped his head, his green eyes revealing he'd had the same thought. "The enemy is aware of which gate each of us is bound to by blood." "Well, that's a big fucking problem," Valen put in as he shoved the long lengths of his violet hair out of his face, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness. "So the enemy knows way more about us than we thought?" Merrick nodded. "It appears so." "How the hell is that possible?" Cal looked between them all, the tips of his blonde ponytail fluttering in the breeze that gently swept around him. "They took Escher and Merrick's blood. Maybe that—" Merrick shook his head this time. "No, it's almost as if someone is feeding the enemy information," which was exactly what Daimon had been thinking. "Or they're with the enemy." Daimon exchanged a troubled look with Merrick. "The woman they keep mentioning?" Cal said with a concerned glance at Karis. Karis twisted the silver band on his thumb. "I am not sure, but I shall send another messenger to Father to see if he can think of anyone who might be working with them." "Last time you asked, he sent a list as long as my dick," Valen muttered. "So a short list?" Cal grinned at Valen when he scowled at him. Karis raised his right hand, and that was all it took to have both of them falling back into line. Valen was right, though. The list of possible enemies Hades had sent back had been hundreds of names long, far too many for their father to investigate, especially when Escher was missing and the majority of his legions were searching for him in the underworld. Karis's green eyes shifted to Merrick. "Are you feeling strong enough to close Rome?" Merrick was quick to nod. "Whatever it takes to turn the tide in our favor." "I can close New York." Daimon lowered his hand from his side, aware that it wouldn't be dark in New York for hours yet. As it was, Rome would only be on the cusp of nightfall. They were going to have to wait in the city for at least an hour before it was dark enough to summon the gate and close it. "We can go there after Rome. Ares and Cal could assist me." Karis looked down at Daimon's side, his gaze gaining a concerned shimmer as he shook his head. "It is best we do one at a time." Which was a nice way of saying he didn't think Daimon was strong enough right now to handle it. That grated a little, but he tamped down that feeling and crushed it out of existence. His brother was right, and it was better they didn't weaken their forces by too much. Merrick being out of action for a few days would be bad enough. He wasn't really sure why he had been so quick to offer anyway. He looked at Merrick, realized that he had wanted to be the one to sleep for a few days. Between the nightmares of Escher in the underworld that plagued him whenever he tried to sleep, and the nightmare that was Cass plaguing him whenever he was awake, he was bone-deep tired, on the verge of collapse. Being in a coma-level sleep would give him back his strength, and if he was lucky when he woke, either Cass would be long gone or she would have been so worried about him that she would have fallen madly in love with him while taking care of him. A guy could dream. He didn't have such luck, though. He knew that. If he slept for a few days like he wanted, he would probably never see Cass again. And gods, that would kill him. He tilted his head back and looked at the stars that covered the heavens, at the spine of the Milky Way that arched overhead, and sighed. He couldn't go on like this. He was drowning. Darkness surged through him. He let the wave roll over him and pull him under. Chapter 18. Cass tried to listen to what Mari was saying as she talked to Katerina and Ava, but it was hard to focus when her mind was filled with Daimon. Anger clashed with worry, the spark he had ignited in her when he had benched her, as Valen had called it, still going strong despite the 1,000 troubling scenarios that were running through her head. She nibbled the corner of a second brownie square and glanced at Aries. He was coddling Megan again, sitting with her on the cream couch to Cass's left, his arm slung around Megan's slight shoulders. His smile didn't hide the concern that shone in his dark eyes, flickering in the embers that lit them. Those eyes slid to her and narrowed in the way they had done every time he had looked at her over the past hour. When Daimon, Callistos, and Valen had left to go to the Hong Kong gate, she might have taken out her frustration and anger on Aries, just a little. Mari had talked her down, convincing her to remain in the mansion when all she wanted to do was transport herself to the gate. She knew staying tucked within the wards was the safe thing to do when the enemy was targeting her. But the thought of Daimon out there fighting those goddesses and the gods only knew how many demons turned her stomach, had her burning with a need to go and help him. Mari patted her knee. Cass looked down at her hand as it came to rest on her black leather trousers, and then up into her friend's blue eyes. Catching the worry, she tried to hide with a soft smile. Callistos was out there too, and Mari had suffered the same benching as Cass had. Only Mari hadn't taken out her frustration on the sole brother left in the mansion. Tremendous power suddenly pressed down on her, and she stiffened and twisted at the waist to look over the back of the couch, her eyes locking on the door. It opened and Karis strode in, darkness rolling off him, fiercer than she had ever felt it. Had something happened? Callistos followed hot on his heels. Mari was on her feet in a heartbeat and rushing to him. Cass rose more slowly, her heart fluttering in her throat, blood thundering in her ears.
Where are the others?
Because she couldn't sense Merrick and Valen, or Daimon. Karis's green eyes fixed on Aries rather than her.
Merrick is going to seal the Rome gate.
The anger that had been burning at a low simmer in her blood flared into an inferno. Karis had sent Merrick, Valen, and Daimon to close a gate straight after they had defended one. She leveled a glare on him and then looked at Callistos, worry tangling inside her as she spotted all the bruises and cuts on him, and how tired he looked. Was Karis trying to get 3 of his brothers killed? She glanced over her shoulder at Aries, silently demanding he say something. He glared at Karis, too, the fires of the underworld burning in his eyes.
You couldn't have waited?
Karis shook his head.
We need another gate closed. Daimon offered to close New York too, but 1 gate at a time now. We shouldn't rush this.
Shouldn't rush it. He had rushed it by sending 3 of his brothers straight to a gate fresh from a battle, when they were probably tired and in need of rest. Karis's cold green eyes slid to meet hers.
I would like a word with you.
Cass tipped her chin up and stared right back at him, not hiding any of the anger she felt as his words ran around her head, and as she thought about Daimon. Why had he offered to close a gate? Doing so would render him unconscious for days, if not weeks. She recalled what he had said to Callistos about being unable to sleep. Was he so desperate to escape reality and snatch the sleep that eluded him that he would endanger himself to achieve it? She knew the disappearance of Escher weighed heavily upon him, but placing himself at risk to escape that was foolish, reckless. The anger that burned inside her only blazed hotter. She was going to be having words with him when he returned, just as she was going to have words with his brother. She followed Karis out through the white wood-framed panels that had been pushed back to reveal the garden. He banked left, following the wooden walkway that ran around the courtyard. He moved like a shadow in the darkness, his steps unnervingly silent. The boards creaked beneath her weight from time to time, cutting through the tense silence, but he never made a sound. When he reached the end of the walkway near her temporary quarters, he stopped and stepped down onto the wide stone slab that had been placed there. He slipped his feet into a pair of slippers and she did the same, and followed him into the garden, her anger giving way to nerves as the darkness encompassed them and the voices of the others drifted into the distance. The moonlight cast faint silver highlights in Karis's black hair and over his shoulders. When he reached the bridge that spanned the koi pond, he stopped and pivoted to face her. The moon cast his face in shadow, but green flecks glowed in his eyes. She moved around him, forcing him to turn his profile to the moon, because something about the way his eyes glowed unnerved her and had her pulse quickening. When light bathed the side of his face, those nerves settled and her courage rose again. She spoke before he could.
Sending your brothers to seal a gate straight after a fight was reckless, dangerous.
His features remained flat, unreadable, as he stared at her in silence. As time trickled past, she struggled to keep her nerves at bay, to keep her chin tipped up and confidence shining through. He wasn't the first one to attempt to impose some sort of command over her by looking at her in such a way, and he probably wouldn't be the last. It didn't bother her. She wouldn't be cowed by him. She wasn't afraid of him. She really wasn't. She was about to demand that he say something when he finally spoke.
I have seen you with Daimon, and I witnessed the effect you are having on him on the battlefield tonight.
His voice turned colder, chilling her as she suddenly curled her fingers into fists at her sides, steeling herself. Karis took a step towards her, and she barely resisted the urge to back off one. Darkness rolled off him in menacing waves, blackening his eyes, and the power he always emitted rose, wrapped like shadows around her that felt as if they were choking her. His eyes narrowed slightly, a cruel twist to his lips as he leaned towards her and whispered,
"If you hurt my brother, I will see to it that not only you, but your entire coven suffer for it."
Her spine stiffened.
"How dare you threaten my family?"
She slapped him hard, her hand flying before she could consider the consequences, her heart jacking up into her throat as her blood thundered and adrenaline surged. He didn't even flinch. Cass struck him again, the sound of her palm connecting hard with his cheek ringing in the still night air. His pupils widened for a heartbeat before they shrank back to normal. She hit him a third time, catching his mouth more than his cheek. He exhaled hard, the sound breathy as his pupils dilated and contracted again. But she felt no anger in him, no sense that he would retaliate. There was only the strange feeling that he wanted more. She stared at him, scratched out the thought she'd had about him when he had moved like a shadow along the walkway. This side of him unnerved her the most. Something was seriously wrong with this god. He lifted his right hand and brushed the pad of his thumb across his lower lip, catching the blood there. He sucked it from his thumb and stared at her, silent and still, an air of expectation surrounding him, because he wanted her to strike him again. She stood her ground despite her nerves, despite the fact half of her wanted to leave and the rest wanted to slap him again.
"I would never hurt Daimon, so there's no need to threaten my family,"
she bit out, emphasizing each word as she stared into his green eyes. She wasn't sure how long she stood there in the garden, her flesh chilling as the night dragged on, locked in a silent battle with Karis. But it was growing light, and she was cold to the bone when the scent of snow and spice hit her, warmed her. Daimon. Karis must have sensed his return, too, because he blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, it was as if nothing had happened. His perfect features lost all the darkness they had held, and his eyes lost the twisted hungers that had filled them. He turned away from her and strode towards the house, and when he reached it and stepped up onto the walkway, he said,
"I will tend to him."
He took Merrick from Valen and carried him toward his room, turning his profile to Cass. She stared at him, studying his features and the feelings she could sense in him, and frowned. He was the calm and collected god she had always witnessed, not even a lingering trace remaining of the person who had been standing here with her, craving violence from her, taking pleasure from it. Did his brothers know about that side of him, the one who had looked ready to provoke her just so she would strike him again? She edged her eyes toward the main room of the house, cursed in Russian when she saw the state of Daimon. Her heart lurched into her throat as he hobbled onto the walkway, his right arm banded around his stomach and blood covering the left side of his face. The urge to strike Karis blasted through her, coupled with a desperate need to go to Daimon and a foolish hope he would accept her help, because she needed to take care of him. She sent a prayer to the gods that for once Daimon wouldn't fight her, even when the darkness that shone in his eyes as they met hers said that he would, said more than that to her. It whispered a terrible truth. Karis wasn't the only one who courted pain. Daimon had let the demons hurt him. Chapter 19. Darkness was a living, writhing thing inside him. It whispered, coaxed, and seduced, and Daimon did his best not to listen to it, not to be swayed by its black magic, to ignore the craving for violence that blazed inside him. But it was strong, far stronger than he was in his current state, his mind fragmented, torn in two directions. Images stuttered across the darkest corners of that mind, taunting him with flashes of Cass with another man, a faceless and nameless one who was her destiny. who she was apparently resolved to go to even though he had seen the doubts in her eyes. Daimon stared at the demons surrounding him, singling out all the males, his mind labeling them as Cass's intended. He cut through them, a whirlwind of ice and steel, taking some down with spears and shards of glittering crystal and others with a swift stroke of a blade over their throats. Valen's lightning shook the ground, lashing down from the heavy black clouds like white-purple whips to light up the darkness. Each strike filled the air with the scent of demon blood, rousing Daimon's darkness, keeping it at the fore. It seeped deeper into him, snaked around his heart and murmured to him, whispering taunts about the males around him, about them and Cass, about how she would never be his. Daimon slid across the dry grass of the ancient Stadio Palatino and used one of his throwing knives to slice across the shins of a female demon as her claws cut through the air above him. She shrieked and leaped backwards into the path of a lightning strike. Blood and bone exploded outwards, and Daimon was swift to step, avoiding being hit by it. He landed in the middle of a group of 6 male demons. All of them turned on him, their eyes glowing with sick hunger in the darkness. He was sure his looked the same. From the ends of their fingers, long claws grew, 4-inch talons that promised pain if they caught him. Their dilated pupils narrowed into thin vertical slits as he faced them, rising to his full height, showing them that he wasn't afraid of them. 6 or 60, it didn't matter. They would never win against him. Rain hid in a heavy downpour, turning the grass to mud beneath his boots, saturating him in a heartbeat. He casually ran a hand over his white hair, slicking it back. His heart beat steadily, a hard drumming against his chest as he waited. Beyond the 6, in the middle of the long rectangular courtyard of the monument, Valen fought another 6, keeping them away from Merrick. Beyond Valen, Merrick stood facing the gate that hovered a few feet above the floor of the Stadio Palatino. The colorful light it emitted shimmered over the broken columns that lined all sides of the grass and the crumbling walls of the ancient Roman buildings that enclosed it. 2 of the demons nearest Daimon twitched, one shifting foot to foot as the other licked his lips, his forked tongue flickering over them. Daimon had always hated the more lizard-like of the demon breeds. None of these 6 had a scratch on them thanks to the tough, scaly skin they could call in a heartbeat to cover their more delicate human-looking flesh. One to his left hissed through razor-sharp teeth, and suddenly all of them were on him. He grinned and hunkered down, called on his power and savored the rush as shards of ice shot up all around him, managing to catch at least one of the males and spill blood. He attacked the moment the demons backed off a step, lashing out with the throwing knife he clutched in his left hand, pumping his power into it so the blade caused ice to ripple over the surface of every demon it struck. These demons might be able to shield themselves with scales, but even that wouldn't protect them from his ice. One demon went down, hissing and snarling as he clutched at his arm. Ice cascaded over it, glittering in the light of the gate as it took hold, thickening and growing to encase the male's entire arm. Daimon spun and brought his leg up, struck the male's arm with his boot. It shattered. The demon howled and backed off, desperately clutching at the stump left behind. The remaining 5 demons looked at their comrade and then at Daimon. He smiled slowly, waited. A demon behind him was the first to make a move, lunging for him rather than fleeing as Daimon had expected. He twisted to face the male, brought his arm up and blocked the demon's attack. He grabbed the male's wrist with his other hand and went to throw him. Daimon bellowed as claws raked down his back and he arched forwards, pain searing at him like an inferno. Bastards! He spun on his heel and hurled his right hand forwards, unleashing the blade he clutched in it. It nailed the demon in his shoulder, but the male didn't go down. Daimon cursed. In his haste to retaliate, he had forgotten to imbue it with his power. 2 demons piled onto him, claws slicing through his roll-neck long sleeve, the scent of his blood joining the vile coppery odor of demon blood in the air. The darkness he had been fighting to hold back surged forwards, the intoxicating rush of it consuming him in a heartbeat. Daimon grinned and grappled with one of the demons, grabbing his wrists and hurling his head forwards. His forehead cracked off the demon's one, and the male grunted and reared back. The second male attacked, slamming into Daimon's side and taking him down. Pain erupted in a wave as he hit the slick grass, and he relished it. He grinned as the demon pummeled him, not bothering to block his blows. He took every one of them as the darkness rose inside him, twisted tighter and devoured more of him. Daimon grabbed the demon and rolled with him, pinned him beneath him on the wet grass, and slammed his fists into his face, knocking his head left and right. Wherever Daimon's fist struck him, scales erupted and ice covered them. He bore down on the male, his lips peeling back off his fangs in a wide smile, as black blood flowed from the lacerations on the demon's face, quick to freeze under Daimon's assault. He didn't feel the pain in his side, didn't notice the heat spreading across it. But he did notice the way the demon laughed at him, his eyes lighting up with sick glee. Daimon slammed his right fist into the male's head, bone cracking beneath the force of the blow. Silence reigned. He shoved onto his feet and stumbled, twisting to face the other wretches. Heat bloomed and spread down his left hip, fire pooling at the apex of it. It wasn't enough. He bared his fangs at the demons, goading them, needing more. Two were quick to take him up, launching at him in tandem. He danced with them, his grin still in place as he pivoted and turned, ducked and dodged and landed blows, and let them strike him. Each kick, punch, or slash of claws sent a ripple of satisfaction through him, had the darkness purring inside him, pushing him to seek more. He did. He surrendered to the dark wave, let it pull him under, and savored each blow they landed, every flare of fire and searing jolt of pain that struck him, leaving him only wanting more. Daimon fought them, holding back his power as best he could, wanting this battle to last. He gave up blocking them, closed quarters, and took every blow. He closed his hand around the front of one of the demon's throats and frowned when the male withered before his eyes, skin turning blue and eyes rolling back in his head. No, he wanted more. He shook the dead male, growled when he didn't respond, and turned on his comrades, hurling the body at them. One took the bait, but another ran, leaving him with only two. He left himself open, inviting the pain, the darker side of his blood at the helm. Each slash of the male's claws only made him grin. Impudent wretch, as if this thing was strong enough to best him. He shot a hand out and seized the second male, hurling him at the first, knocking them both down. The urge to leap on them was strong. Daimon fought it, staggered back a step and tried to rein the darkness in, to bring it back under control. But he didn't want to. He wanted this pain, this oblivion. He needed it, because it was better than the other thing that awaited him if he regained control. Physical pain he could bear. Emotional pain he couldn't. The two demons leaped on him. He closed his eyes, welcomed the pain as they ripped at him, snarling and hissing. No. He growled and ice shot up all around him, the shards so close that they cut him as well as impaling the demons. He breathed hard and the ice shattered, freeing him of its cage. He stumbled backwards, shaking his head, driving back the darkness, clawing back control. He didn't want this. He didn't. Darkness was a living, writhing thing inside him. It whispered, coaxed, and seduced, and all Daimon could do was listen to it, to be swayed by its black magic, to crave more of the violence that had come before. The pain. Was this how Escher felt? He stared at the gate, at the rings that were shrinking, winking out of existence, and reached for the other side of it, for Escher. Pain flooded him again, anger and desperation following it, together with despair. Escher. He stepped forwards, heading for the gate, picking his way over the remains of the demons. His brother needed him. It gave him the strength to fight back, to resist the darkness and step towards the light. Escher needed him, and he wouldn't fail his brother. He would be strong. He would do all in his power to conquer the darkness, the pain, and remain, ready for his return. Escher needed him strong. He needed him to take care of Aiko. He needed him to be there for him when he came back, so Daimon could bring him back. Light flickered, the heavy pulsing weight of the power the gate emitted weakening, the connection between him and the underworld fading with it as Merrick finally finished sealing it. His link to Escher faded too. Physical pain gave way to emotional pain as the gate finally winked out of existence in the center of the Stadio Palatino. Merrick collapsed on the muddy ground of the ancient monument, and Valen rushed to him, gathered him into his arms, and looked at Daimon. Daimon just stared at him, fatigue beating in every fiber of his being, mingled with the darkness that refused to release him now he had allowed it to take hold. Black thoughts whispered in his mind, terrible things that kept him skirting the edge of the abyss, kept him filled with agony and despair, and rage, the depth of which he had never felt before. A twisted, dangerous need continued to consume him. He had been a fool to court the darker side of his blood, but he had been desperate for some release, for something he felt he needed even when he wasn't sure what it was. "I'm taking him back." Valen weighed each word, eyeing him closely as his blonde eyebrows slowly lowered over bright golden eyes. "You okay?" Daimon managed a stiff nod. He looked down at his left side, felt nothing as he watched blood trickling from the gash above his hip. Darkness continued to writhe, to twist and snarl, to murmur in his ear, to taunt him with images of Cass with another man. She was meant to be his. He felt that deep in his soul, in the darkest corners of it where a possessive beast snarled and paced, tormented by the need to seize hold of her but fearing reaching out. The fear always won. It turned him in circles, always leading him back to the start, as if it enjoyed torturing him, making him feel he could win Cass only to throw 100 moments at him when he had seen in her that she would never abandon her duty. He wanted her more than anything, but the thought he might come to know her taste, that he might find the courage to unleash his hunger and this desperate need for her only to lose her in the end, was unbearable. It would be torture far worse than having to endure centuries of loneliness because of his power. Daimon stared down at the lacerations that covered his legs and chest, that littered his arms. What was she doing to him? She was the wave, washing over him to pull him under, letting him break for air only to suck him under again. She was killing him. Another image of her with a faceless man flashed across his mind. The darkness within him roared in response, flooding him with a need for violence, to lash out and strike at everything around him. The demons were dead. There was no one to give him the pain and destruction he craved. He shoved his hands through his hair and clutched the sides of his head, squeezed it hard as he gritted his teeth, tried to purge the darkness he had foolishly allowed to take hold of him. "Daimon?" Valen's soft voice reminded him he wasn't alone. The darkness turned its sights on his brother. "Give me a minute," Daimon growled, hoping Valen would get the hint and leave him, because he didn't want to hurt his brother. "Sure." Valen disappeared with Merrick. Daimon exhaled hard and sucked down another breath, wrestling with the black rage, the hunger, and the hurt. He shut out its insidious whispers, refused to obey it, and humped the demons who lived in Rome, seeking another fix, seeking more pain. He squeezed his eyes shut as the fight at the Rome gate replayed, trying to stop it from happening even when he knew it wasn't possible. Everything fast-forwarded, rushing past his eyes in a bloody blur, culminating in the dreadful moment he had let the darkness overcome him. In that moment, he hadn't cared what the demons did to him. He had welcomed it. He clawed and tugged his white hair back, his scalp stinging as he gritted his teeth and growled through emerging fangs. This wasn't him. He just needed to rest, to recover from his injuries, to find some peace for a moment, and then he could pull himself back together and continue, without surrendering to the need burning inside him. The need to take hold of Cass and never let her go. He stepped and didn't bother to remove his boots, because he was going to leave an unholy mess in the mansion no matter what he did. Rather than appearing inside, he landed on the walkway that ran around the courtyard. A mistake. Cass stood before him by the arched wooden bridge, facing Karis. The darker side of his blood that had been slowly fading roared back to life at the sight of his brother so close to her. Karis moved before the need to rip his brother away from her could manifest, distancing himself from the sorceress. His brother glanced at him as he reached the walkway. Daimon glared at him, and then at Cass. What had they been doing alone in the garden? Why did Cass look flushed, her pale blue eyes bright? Those eyes gained a horrified edge as they landed on him, swiftly followed by concern. That concern wounded him more deeply than any blade could, cleaving him open, tearing at him. He didn't want to see such soft emotions in her eyes, not directed towards him. It hurt too much. Cass hurried over to him. Daimon stalked past her, his head turning, vision blurring for a second before the dizziness passed. He held his side, stemming the flow of blood, unsure what to do as gravel crunched beneath his boots. He couldn't go to his room even when he craved sleep. The covers of his bed would act as a wick, drawing more blood out of him. He needed to fix his wounds before he could rest, but he was so goddamn tired. His thoughts blurred together as he mindlessly walked forwards, going somewhere. He just didn't know where. Anywhere was better than here near Cass. Only he couldn't escape her. She followed hot on his heels, her presence a pain he couldn't endure, rousing the softer emotions he had tried to banish tonight, tried to kill.
Let me take care of you.
Her voice was soft, sweet, a balm to his aching heart. Gods, he wanted to give in to her. He wanted to place himself in her hands and trust it would all work out exactly the way he wanted it to. But he wasn't a fool. "Go away," he grunted. She huffed and stepped around him, blocking his path, her eyes glittering with silver stars as they narrowed on him.
I've seen you fight, and you're stronger than any demon. None of them should have been able to deal this much damage to you, unless you let them.
The last 4 words leaked from her lips as desperation filled her eyes. They danced between his, seeking an answer, one she wasn't going to like. Her brow furrowed and she whispered,
Why would you do that?
The softness, the concern, and the hurt gave way to something far darker when he didn't answer, just stepped around her and kept trudging forwards. She appeared in his path again, her face a mask of darkness, accusation in her eyes and anger in her tone.
Why, Daimon?
She cupped his cheeks with both hands, her touch too warm and soft for him to bear. It destroyed him. He took one last look at her and stepped. Cold wind whipped around him, cutting him to the bone, driving ice into his marrow. He let it buffet and chill him as he stared at the endless, frigid white that surrounded him. Let it numb him. He wanted to laugh at that. He had been numb for centuries. Now he wanted to feel, and he was too afraid to do it. He was too afraid of where it might lead. He was too afraid that if he dared to love again, he might lose Cass too.